I have a comment and then I have a question.
Lovely.
And I'm very happy that you said, let's look at the context of January 6th in what we are studying now, because it was so very, very relevant.
Yes.
So may I go ahead?
Please.
So this section is what, 4.4? The final paragraph, I thought Kenneth Smith hit the nail right on the head and drove it all the way into the board, because it was exactly what was happening. And if I may read it, the final paragraph of this whole section.
Sure.
He said, in reading the news or an article or a novel, learn to sensitize yourself to things that have a mythic or archetypal or essential resonance that seem piquant to your deeper resources for conceptualizing and evaluating.
Yes.
Search doggedly for the essential in all things and do not be despondent. And I was very despondent. I'm a Black woman who's an immigrant, that at first you will not even have a clarified and a precise vocabulary for it. Le mot juste, and I'm not French, is an ever incandescent search for those successes will indicate that you are learning to coordinate the inner cosmos of orgasmic language with the outer universe of realities and relations and nuances. I thought that was profound.
Yes.
Do not expect to understand at once the ego world items and relations that speak to your mythos soul. It traffics in the materials in which ego sees no clear and distinct rational value.
Yes.
And then here's where he gives us an instruction. He says, keep a transitional notebook, ego to soul and ego to spirit. Early Greek philosophy took the form, men say X, but I tell you Y. And that's right where we're living.
Yes.
Today, we must understand this as men who are all ego, but I who am struggling to learn the worldview of soul and spirit. That's why we're sitting here at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Well, where I am living is 2 o'clock.
Yes.
We either strive to overcome this schizophrenia or we succumb to it. There is no third route. Last Wednesday was a really shock to my senses because I did not come of age in this country. What I heard was history, and what I saw was absolutely terrifying.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
I couldn't believe in today's world that was going to be allowed to happen. I listened to the current president all the time, and I heard his dog whistles, and sometimes there were foghorns, but they got blown under the carpet all the time.
Yes.
And I mean, privately, I was dating this guy, and after my third date, he turned out to be a Trump supporter. I said, please don't speak to me ever again. Because I found the whole thing so repelling. And it wasn't about a political philosophy. It was about what I considered virtues, honesty, decency, integrity. All those were the big ones that I respected. Mm-hmm. And so that's my analysis of the week. Now, the second part of my question is, and I don't know if now's the time to ask the question, or are you going to consider the discussion? Go ahead.
Let's give it a shot and see what it is.
Oh, so it's as I got the myth part of this conversation down, but I was having a little bit of difficulty tying the logos into it and how the two of them act in synchronization. So I read another paragraph which I thought tied it up, but I want you to expand on it.
Yes.
It said, myth is intuitive truth whose roots and harmonics are so profound that they exceed our capacities for wording and reasoning at any given stage of our cultural or individual evolution. Yes, what I saw exceeded my capacities for wording and reasoning. And this is a cultural evolution where we are. He says, myth is a pre-logical form of logos. And that kind of stopped me, because that to me seemed like it was linking the two.
Yes.
So I wanted you to expand on that. A struggling or to be
Yes.
struggled for deeper sense of the wholeness of things.
Yes.
The involuted and the orgasmic truth for which the human ego and intellect are so constitutionally and methodically ill-fitted.
Yes.
Well said.
Yes.
And so that was my question.
Well, as usual, you go right to the heart of things. So congratulations. For those who are trying to follow along, the opening paragraph that she read is the final paragraph of section 4.3. So if you just jump down to the 4.4 header and back up one paragraph, you'll see what she was reading. What she read just now is from the bottom of page 62. It's from almost dead center in 4.3. And it's one of the turning points where he says some things that we could not possibly have decoded in previous weeks. It has taken the workup from the previous weeks to get us to the point where we've got the resources to pull apart what he's saying here. And this is one of the things that Kenneth Smith does that keeps me coming back to him, is that he can write these extremely dense, these paragraphs and sentences that are extremely dense with meaning because they're alluding to things that could take whole books to explain. And he's just bringing them in and putting them together into a sort of new layer of understanding. So what he's doing here is he's linking mythos and logos at a level that, in past weeks, as Sharon pointed out, we've contrasted mythos and logos as though they're two different things. We've talked about mythos cultures versus logos cultures. The whole title of the book, Mythos and Logos, suggests that we're talking about opposites. But as Sharon points out, in this sentence, he actually says myth is a pre-logical form of logos. Now, how can they be the same thing if they're opposites? And this is striking right to the heart of the relationship between mythos and logos and the different forms of thought and mentality that we've been talking about for the last month. So this is well worth unpacking. This is what we unpack in these sentences will apply to this whole book. So if people are game, I'd like to start here. And part of the reason why is that this will also help us to understand Wednesday, what happened on the 6th. This is we're seeing the working out of these things. And the problem is that moderns typically don't understand things in this way. And as a result, they are able to do things that they themselves can't put into clear language or clear words. If they could, maybe they wouldn't do those things, but they don't see what it is that they're doing. So you may recall sometime in maybe a month ago, almost at this point, I put together a set of diagrams to introduce us to Kierkegaard and Hegel and Heraclitus and Nietzsche and all that. And those diagrams culminated in an unfinished diagram that introduces mythos culture versus logos culture and how they're structured. And if you guys are willing, I'd like to take us back to that and use that as the guide for this conversation, for what Sharon's asking about. This is where it's going to become clear.
Yeah.
So go
ahead.
And
then later on, when you think you kind of have your diagrams kind of near final form, if you can share that as an online resource for us at a later time.
Very much so.
Thank you, Richard.
Yeah, I'd like to make them put them right into the appendix of the book so that we can look at them whenever we need to. So let's see if I've got the diagram here. Oh, here we go, from January 21st. Yeah, that's it. So I'm going to blow this up big, and then I'm going to share my desktop, and we'll see what he's talking about here with mythos and logos and this weird way of using the terms. There we go. And here's the sharing. Ta-da! Share screen. Okay. Do we all see that? Culture and anti-culture, mythos and logos? Okay.
Yes.
So let's talk about this stack again, because this is what he's talking about. And the first thing that we have to notice is that what we've got on the left is fleshed out, and what we've got on the right isn't fleshed out. All I have is a placeholder for noesis, and I haven't put the rest in here yet. And I'm going to talk us through it today so that we can see what it is. But what's on the left is the Greek concept that culture is not, as modern anthropology teaches us, whatever people happen to be doing. That is a very noetic Verstand way of defining culture. that to the archaic Greeks, culture is a specific prosthesis that human beings use to survive in the natural world. That the natural world is not designed for our benefit, that it exists for its own reasons, and it produced us, and so we have the capacity to align ourselves with it. But because of the way that we have evolved, we, more than any other animal, are easily able to act in ways that put us out of sync with nature. And when we do that, as Kafka warns us, the world always wins. You know, when in the contest between yourself and the world, back the world, says Kafka. And this is what he means. It's like if you do something in which your survival depends upon, for example, the law of gravity not existing, you're in for a disappointment, because it exists and it's going to have its way with you, whether you like it or not. This is why in the ancient worldview, nature takes priority over man. In the classic stack of nature, God, and man, the ancients were the order. They're defined as the order in which nature comes first. And even the gods are subservient to nature. They're expressions of nature. And man is subservient to both. And that's why. Because in the contest between yourself and the world, you have to back the world, because the world will always win. So with that as our premise, nature goes at the top of the list. But the word nature doesn't come from Greek. That comes from Latin. The word nature means having been born. It's a participle. It's of the verb to be born, to give birth. And even to the Romans, who were like us in so many ways, they still had the ancient worldview idea that everything that exists in nature, it's not a design that was stamped out by a creator. It's something that was born, that was at some point a seed, and that has been unfolding over time according to its inner nature and laws of growth. It has been developing to become what it is now. And those same laws of growth are going to keep going. It's going to keep unfolding into something new. And this is why we're born, we rise, we flourish, we decay, we die. There's this whole process of transformation that's built into us as part of our core nature as beings who are born. It's what it means to be natural, is that you have beginnings and endings, and they're in you. But the Greeks used a different term. Phusis was their word for nature, from which we get physics, right? Mm-hmm. But they meant something very different. By physics, we mean something very mechanistic, for which we make exceptions for relativity and for quantum physics, but we still fundamentally are based on intuitively, we think in terms of the Newtonian mechanistic worldview, right? The Cartesian coordinates of space and time and all that. But that's not the way the Greeks saw it. They saw phusis. Phusis, it means becoming. Everything is constantly flowing and changing. That's the definition of nature. Nature is not a bunch of machines and objects that we manipulate. It's a realm in which things are constantly mutating according to the inner laws of their development. And by replacing it with the word nature, the Romans were pinning down birth to death as the specific arc of transformation that they were interested in. But the Greeks began with a more comprehensive idea. You can't step in the same river twice. All things are constantly flowing. You with me so far?
Later, with the effect of Plato, like with things constantly moving and changing, is there the influence of like Plato's thought that they might occasionally be moving towards kind of the ideal form, but yes, not always be there, but.
Yes, Plato was part of a counter-reaction against that archaic Greek worldview. He was attempting to create a static world in which things can exist for all time. He was inspired by Parmenides, whose core saying was, God help us, being is. This was Parmenides' core proposition. And what he meant was the Greeks had a verb to be that meant to exist in a permanent state.
It's like this eternal essence kind of idea.
Parmenides meant it's possible to exist eternally. And from that, he derived his whole counter-natural, counter-phusis, counter-archaic, Apollonian, noetic Verstand philosophical system. And Socrates and Plato were heirs to that system and developed it further. And were attempting to show that it's possible to have an unchanging cosmos in which change is an illusion. There's not actually any change. There's these eternal forms and they just hover out there, and we're all just manifestations of them trying to return to the whole. This was a massive counter-reaction against the archaic.
Rick, so did he name himself Parmenides then?
Well, Parmenides
Did he give himself his own name then? Because it sounds like permanent.
That's a coincidence. The similarity in sounds. It might be a good way to remember him, though. He has a mnemonic.
Yeah, I know. It's kind of a joke. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's good.
I got it, Jenny.
Yeah. So Parmenides was about permanence, right? And he was inspired by the vocabulary of the Greek language. And this is one of the ways in which the Greeks were sometimes not as cosmopolitan as they wished they'd been, and they were sort of more parochial, is this assumption that the language was divine, and therefore everything in it must actually reflect something in reality. So if we had a verb for permanent existence, then the real world itself must also have permanent existence. Now, based on past weeks, you can see that's a profoundly noetic thing to do, to say, I have a world of ideas, and my world of ideas is real. I just assume, I've decided it's real. And I will now describe the real, quote unquote, real world according to the restrictions of my world of ideas. That's what Parmenides set in motion. So that's why we get the schism in Greek culture. There's two different antagonistic Greek cultures over the period in which they're writing. There is an archaic, naturalistic, physis-based, transformational, or organismic culture, which takes biology and the organism and life as its fundamental unit. Yeah, Phil.
Yeah, I like to say something that's kind of interesting.
Please.
A year ago, I had a chance to listen to a very interesting lecture by Roger Penrose. Does anybody know who Roger Penrose is? Anyway, he.
I do. Yes, he's excellent.
Yeah. He jointly won the Nobel Prize this year, I think, for physics. And the lecture was about kind of this subject in a way, but he's coming out of physics. And
Yes.
he was saying, like, there's this in-between world in which the known is not yet known.
Yes.
If you live in nature, the problem with the current analytical calculating mentality is, by the time you work out all the numbers, the saber-toothed tiger will already have gotten you.
Yes.
Yes. So therefore, it was useless in a kind of practical existence to actually do that. So you must, in some ways, I won't quite say that he said feel, but but there's this in-between stage in which you got to make decisions that, in a sense, that has to do with the existing world. Now, apparently, the other guy that's working with him now, I think he's the one that also won the Nobel Prize because they're a team. He's a theoretical. Well, he's an experimental neurologist. Apparently, they discovered this this part in the neurons in the nervous system that's kind of in that state. In other words, and Roger Penrose was sort of making the parallel between particle physics, in other words, quantum physics, in which the double slit experiment, in which at some point it's really there and not there at the same time.
Right.
But once it made the decision after the split, then it's going to be there. But before that time, it could be somewhere else, right? Yes. And so he's saying that actually that somehow is, well, the other guy is saying, because he provided the theory behind it, the other guy was saying that somehow that it's actually in our nervous system, that in-between states in which there is this uncertainty in which the thing is there and not there at the same time, okay?
Right.
But what happened is, like, when you jump the gun, in a sense, and pretend that you already know, then in a sense you've done sort of violence to the process, because at that point, before you know, you actually in a way don't know, but you have to make decisions. But once you made a decision, it's there. and then you eliminate the other possibility. I thought that was fascinating from a physicist because, like, I mean, like, for a physicist, he's really out there, but apparently not, because he won the
Apparently
Nobel
not.
Prize.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, that people talk about that a lot. That we're in you get into the deeper levels of physics and you start to run into situations in which we've got multiple incompatible models for the same phenomenon, and that there are certain conditions that arise in nature at which point one or the other model is the right one to use. But until that moment occurs, it could be both or neither, or it doesn't matter. And if you decide too early which model you're going to use, you sort of rule out things that are true. Your model now can't show them because you've picked the model that doesn't illustrate that. And what Phil's talking about, for those who don't know, he's talking about the classic experiment with using passing light through slits, in which you can force light to behave as either a wave or a particle, depending on how you construct it. And it clearly is one or the other, depending on which way you put the experiment together. And yet, how can it be that it can be both things? And I mean, the models are incompatible. I mean, it's one of the things we struggle with when we're attempting to model this stuff. And where part of where modern physics gets stuck is with thinking that its model is the reality, right? It's like it has lost track of the fact that the real thing that's happening isn't either of those things. Both of them are just models. And that what we're seeing is the inadequacy of our models to represent reality. Any human perspective on the cosmos inherently introduces contradictions and paradoxes because mortal perspectives are finite and the cosmos is infinite. So it's got more angles than we can represent at any one time.
And when we go further into like, quantum, I think as you brought up in, more than once before, like in quantum like mechanics and stuff, like, we get like Schrodinger's cat and things that like are very unintuitive, right?
Is it alive? Is it dead? Or is it
very
somewhere
foreign
in between
to our experience on Earth here?
Yeah. And part of what's happening there is they're wrestling with the problem that our noetic systems of thought are all based on the excluded middle. Things are either true or false, but they can't be in between. Certainly, they can't be any flavor in between. They can't be anywhere in between. It's got to be one or the other. We've sort of built this into our representation. And the problem is that in the cosmos, we often don't know which is the state. Or often it's the case that we're asking the question in such a way that to call the result true or false is both wrong. Because from this angle, from the way this question has been expressed, you would need more information and you need a better model to be able to say conclusively it's true or false. Where we are with our partial model, it's better not to say either one, because if we say either one, we're now warping reality.
And Phil, I think this is before you joined us last week, but like, in our discussions, like I kind of brought up, like it was interesting, the etymology of the word decide, which means to cut off. So kind of like, like in your retelling of kind of doing violence, to like go one way or the other, right? So,
well, yes, I have a friend who apparently is a Aristotelian scholar. So I don't know this well enough, but he actually claims that the Renaissance totally misinterpreted Aristotle.
Yes.
In other words, they made it into a true false proposition, and that wasn't what he was. He was much deeper than that. So could you say something more about that? Because that, if I was to pin anything on anybody, it was not Plato, but it was Aristotle. But if that's false,
right,
then in a sense that's really blowing it up in a way, right?
Well, yeah, Aristotle wasn't a strict Apollonian. Unlike Plato and Parmenides, who were trying to be as Apollonian as possible, Aristotle still maintained his connections to the older archaic Greek philosophies. And so there are places where he talks about Heraclitus and where he talks about the primacy of nature. And in doing so, he's refuting Plato's theory of ideal forms. Aristotle, people, it is possible to read Aristotle as confirming Plato, and that's what the medieval era tried to do. They tried to make Aristotle a bulwark for Plato. But Aristotle, by his own words, was trying to slap Plato around. He was trying to say, you got some stuff right, but you got some stuff horribly wrong, and I'm here as a corrective to try to reground things in the way in the natural world. And so what happens is that science growing up, in the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries is emerging out of the medievalist mindset in which we've already accepted, the warped version of Aristotle as seeming to confirm Plato and Parmenides, seeming to exclude the middle, when actually Aristotle was just trying to describe that system of logic and, not say this is the only logic anyone should use, right? That was the argument that this system of logic is the only way to understand the world is where the warpage happens, that Aristotle didn't put in, but that the medievals put in, and that the early scientists inherited and started building their models out of. So you can see that in this structure right here. Repeatedly, Aristotle refers back to that you need to ground your theories in how things actually are, in the nature of things. You need to study the history and nature, for example, of Greek constitutions before you try to write a book about politics. And he says that in the Politics. And we just read past that as some kind of truism or that must be insignificant. But what he's doing is he's slapping Plato. He's saying you don't get to just make up your own system of politics and then claim that's the system for all time, for all people. He says you have to go back to nature. All your ideas, all your noesis has to be grounded in gnosis. And if you don't do that, then you breed monsters of the mind. You just you become unhinged and you could believe anything. That reason by itself is a threat and a danger because it so easily loses touch with what's real. And this is where culture comes into this. And this is where logos comes into it, which is what we're going to talk about with Sharon, which is this idea of if the world is constantly about changing and becoming, why isn't it a chaos, right? Parmenides was horrified by this archaic notion of radical flux as the nature of the cosmos. And that's why he tried to rebel against it by asserting permanence, that things could permanently exist and could be pure. And it warped. He then began describing what's possible for the mind, what's possible for God, what's possible. He went and reinvented everything in the Greek world from the perspective of this kind of stasis, this pure, crystalline, unchanging stasis. Go ahead, Richard. You got to unmute, though.
Yeah. Sorry, I got too many clicks to keep track of. I remember, I think I was kind of beyond my years, I think, as a child, but I remember first learning that the fate of our sun, is that it will grow and grow and then it'll go nova and then that'll be, kaput for the neighborhood.
Yes.
And, I remember that was deeply, deeply traumatic.
Right.
But in the end I accepted it, but it's like, oh, that's interesting. It was not like, oh, that's interesting. It's like, but yeah.
Yes. Yeah. In the archaic view of the world, death isn't terrifying. Death is natural. You can't be alive without dying. And the fact that you can die means you get to be alive.
Right. All of us are material that used to be inside stars previously that died.
Right. That there's this marvelous quality to it. But if you accept the Parmenidean / Platonic idea, then death is a horror because it seems to be a violation of eternal existence. And so you have to look for escape hatches for how to get out of death. And that's what launched the whole medieval church the way that it went, which was not where early Christianity began. It was a revolt against the more Heraclitean Phusis-based notions of the early Christians. Go ahead, you got your hand up.
So I keep thinking about Karen Armstrong, who wrote The History of Religion. And when she talked about religion, she was talking about the need, there were agricultural societies, and then there were more nomadic societies. And the nomadic societies wanted to invade and feed off the agricultural. And in order to do that, they had to create a hero mythos, which would make people and the spirit be more important than living today. And I think, I can't remember exactly when we were talking. I'm enjoying this immensely. But I wanted to think that maybe this goes back even farther to
Yeah.
the origins of survival as a
Yeah.
human race.
Yeah. Yeah. Certainly cultures that are more grounded in a specific concrete place and time, the way Hegel talks about Begriff, you can't help but figure out that death is a normal part of life, right? If you raise animals, if you raise plants, if you live there long enough, you clue in. It's going on all around you. That there are these constant cycles. Homer talks about it. He says the generations of men are like leaves of a tree. We're like creatures of a season. He calls us ephemeroi, which is one of my favorite lines. He says, we're not gods. He says, even the gods under the Greek conception, because they're part of nature, even they have generations. The Titans rise, they flourish, and then they fall and are replaced by the Olympians who rise, they flourish, they fall, and they'll be replaced by the new gods, Dionysus, the new god who will replace Zeus. That's in his name right there. Even they do, but we do very rapidly in a single generation, a human season from their perspective, and that it's not possible to understand human nature without accepting that, because that's what helps us to figure out what matters. What can we do with the time we have? How can we help each other and take care of each other and do good in the world? But the Parmenidean Platonic idea is based more on a colonizer's idea that I have taken all this stuff and the last thing in the world I want to do is give it back. Now that I have it, I want to end time and create a permanent state in which I'm forever in charge, and the people that I'm dominating will forever serve me. Because the alternative would be that someday they'll overthrow me, and I don't like that idea, especially if I'm mistreating them. The more I mistreat them, the less I like the idea that at some point they're going to throw me over. And so there's this longing for permanence that comes from the act of theft and domination. Richard, go ahead.
I've come to really just come to this idea that American exceptionalism is such a hindrance in not only imagining what's possible, but even just seeing what's actual around us. I mean, that death is a part of everyday, that's been going on in our society, despite all, how much we pat ourselves on the back with how rich and developed and whatever we are, we've had, lots of people die deaths of despair, on Skid Row, in the Appalachians, and now which has further been made more, more visible with the spreading of the opiate crisis. Just recently, and this is already this is recently with the in the fall winter with the surge of the coronavirus, and then these reporters are talking to healthcare professionals that that these healthcare that these hospital systems are being overwhelmed, and we're getting to a point where healthcare is being rationed, and they're just saying, oh, it's so hard to imagine. And it's it's if you were to just watch the news and see what America does abroad, and we have these war zones in the Middle East because of our foreign policy, and people just dying and untended to in the whole, I don't know, it's just sort of upsetting. But
so, one way to think about that, and I'll call you in just a second, Sharon. One way to think about it is if you're marginalized and the status quo sucks, change is good. You want change because this sucks. You'd like to make things better. But if you're privileged, if you've taken a whole bunch of stuff from a whole lot of people, then change is bad. It threatens all the things that you have. And especially the happier you are with what you have, the less you're going to want things to change. When people talk about that we send the military around the world to protect our legitimate interests, what they mean is that the status quo, the relationship, the way that it's structured right now, they're making enormous amounts of money off of, and they don't dare let that be risked by allowing change to happen. And so it encourages them to try to create an artificial stasis that stands in the way of phusis and it enforces the status quo as though it were possible to hold still. I'm going to come back to that in a moment, but first, Sharon. Oh, I think you're on mute.
I apologize for that. Two things I wanted to just follow upon. What Richard said about myth, that is right on the money. And because yesterday's New York Times, the central article in the editorial was the myth of American innocence. And I think that our society, having come from having matured in another one,
Yes.
is driven by multiple myths to the point of being non-functional.
Yes. Yes. This
And
what you're describing is what Kenneth Smith would call anti-myths.
Anti-myths. And where we are now with the coronavirus, and I want to follow up on what Richard said. They're saying, imagine we have to ration healthcare. Well, having practiced as a physician in multiple systems for 45 years, we've been doing this for a long time.
That's right.
I've practiced in inner city hospitals and I've sat on ethics committees, which was my first introduction to philosophy, Kant, and the utilitarian guy, Jeremy Bentham, right? And ethics committees, one of the major things we talked about was the distribution of resources.
Yes.
And particularly when you came to inner city hospitals. So the fact that the virus is pushing this to the forefront, this is another part of the myth. It was always there, but we believed otherwise.
Yes, that's right. That's right. So let's pull it to the logos, to Sharon's question. What gets us into trouble here is that in the original archaic Greek concept, the logos played an essential role. And that's a mythos culture concept of the logos. But in logos culture, logos plays a different role. It's a more central role, but it's a more artificial kind of logos. So we have two logoi. We have the logos of mythos culture, which we do with a capital L. And we have the logos of logos cultures, which we do with a lowercase l. And I'm going to show you the two so that you can see them and see clearly what they are. They're both based on the idea of lawfulness. That, you know, if from a mythos perspective, the lawfulness is that physis itself is not actually a realm of chaos at all. It's to a Parmenidean horrified by the concept of change and death and losing all their wealth. You know, physis may seem like, you know, just anarchy and chaos and all the terrible things that they're trying to stop. But from a mythos perspective, physis is why we exist at all. Every good thing we ever wanted comes from physis. The process of change is also the process of the growth of the fruits or the crops, right? It's the growth of people to their maturity where they gain their powers and are able to work in the world. The development of language so we can communicate. All the changes we like come from physis. So we can't hate it, or we're hating ourselves and everything that we like. We have to acknowledge that there is a kind of transformation and change and flow that is a natural transformation and flow that generates good things along with whatever bad things that it generates with. The same cycle of life that gives us death, which we may or may not like, also gives us birth and the ability to have the life in the first place, which we do like. So, you know, we kind of can't draw artificial boundaries in the middle of it and say, well, we want this, but we don't want that, when they're part of the same cycle. And so what to a mythos culture, the logos is the lawfulness of those transformations. They say it's obviously not chaos or we wouldn't exist. We depend on too many things. We need our air, we need our water, we need our food, we need warmth, we need all these things. And if physis was just a chaos, like the Parmenides say, it would be too chaotic for us to exist. We're too dependent on these consistent conditions. So therefore, there is a lawfulness, a deep lawfulness to the transformations of physis. And we owe everything to that lawfulness. And Heraclitus, for example, specifically talks about this, and he calls it the logos. The logos is the lawfulness that results in the unfolding organismic order of nature that makes all things possible. Capital L logos. Yeah, go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, could I put in slightly different words to make sense?
Yeah, please.
What
Take
I
a
know.
shot.
Well, it seems to me what you're describing, physis, is kind of like the source, if you want to say, kind of the creative energy, or maybe even a volcano that spills out all the possibilities. And the job of logos is not to constrain it, but to gather this sort of eruption and in a sense sort it out in a way that makes sense within society or within whatever, rather than the fact that it is a kind of hard-bound constraint in which, in a sense, doesn't even allow the eruption to take place. So it seems to me the spilling out, the fountain, I shouldn't say volcano, the fountain that flows out.
The cornucopia.
Yeah, must also be gathered. And that's the job of logos, to gather it in a sense that makes sense in relationship to our existence.
Yes. Yes. And I like that. And let me add another metaphor, because it's worth doing this. We should come at it from a few angles. Another metaphor is that the logos is the character of the physis. It's its inner nature that it works according to. It's its personality, if you use a modern terminology, but you could also say it's its ethos, it's its ethics, it's its character. Although we can imagine chaotic physis that could go in every which way, the actual physis that we live in instead has this character that makes it act in certain ways and not in others, and that character is the logos. And that's why it's instead of pouring forth a volcano of things, it pours forth the cornucopia of things. And thank goodness that's why we get to be here. We are among the things poured forth by the physis acting this way. So you with me so far?
Yes. Last night I actually listened to a very, very interesting lecture by Herbie Hancock, and he was talking about Miles Davis. Actually, it was longer than that, but there's a part about Miles Davis that was interesting. He said at one point he was in Miles Davis's band, and he sort of got stuck. Like everything is always like happening, and everybody kind of knew that he was stuck, and he was very frustrated. And he said, Miles Davis came up to him and says, "Leave out the butter notes." And so he didn't quite know what that meant. So he thought about it. He said, well, he must mean like leave out the obvious notes, right? Because he was falling into a pattern of the constraints. And he decided to leave out, I think, the third, the fifth, and the seventh. Okay. And what he discovered was like it opened up other notes that was restricted before. And he thought when he first heard him playing, he thought that was terrible. It was terrible. But he was so surprised when the audience responded so positively that they got it, right? And he said he understood like the wisdom that Miles Davis imparted to him, which was in a sense, you have to make the selection to open up the possibilities rather than close it down, right?
Right.
And he had followed the tradition so much that he ended up getting stuck and always ended up at the same place.
Right. And that's something that people can do. It's really easy for people to organize ourselves according to patterns that stifle the creativity that's possible. And what's fascinating about the logos of the physis is that it does the opposite. It organizes, as you were implying earlier, Phil, it organizes the universe not according to just restrictions or blockages, but in ways that are fecund or productive or pregnant with possibilities. And you see the Greeks and Kenneth Smith use this language a lot. They bring in sex terminology, they bring in birth terminology, pregnancy terminology. So they're saying, the nature is pregnant with possibilities and that it organizes itself around those pregnancies, which is a completely different way than how people typically organize things. He says it's organized around generative principles that generate things, that are little fountains of possibilities. And it's in the interactions of these different principles and their conflicts with each other that the things that we value in the world take form from. So the law of gravity is not so much like a traffic cop telling people what they can and can't do as it is a producer of stars and planets, right? If it weren't for gravity, there'd be no sun, there'd be no planet, there'd be no us. And so it's more like each of these things is a different kind of fountain or cornucopia. And so What's a challenge for us is this is a different way of thinking about the world. It's not like a tool or, or a toolbox that we go and grab some tools out of and hammer on things. And it's not like a pantry that we just walk into and grab the things we want. Instead, it's this kind of pregnant ecosystem of forces that are constantly giving birth to new things. And if we want to, what it means is, if we want to align human societies in a productive, sustainable way with nature, we have to align with those. We have to figure out what those principles are that are generating everything. And we have to figure out what those conflicts are between different principles that can cause trouble, and try to organize ourselves so that we stay out of the way of the traffic jams, but tap into the cornucopias, right? That's what you want to do. And so what you're trying to do when you build a culture is not just take a vote and see what people feel like doing. And you're not just asking some tyrant what he wants to impose on everybody. None of that would be any good. What you're trying to do is study the structure of nature and then arrange the culture to fit into nature so that we belong there, so that nature isn't trampling us all the time because of our misunderstandings of the way things actually are. That's what this stack is about. It's about the stack of logical structure of the cosmos, not logic that we impose on it, but the logic it seems to have independently of us. And then our attempts to understand that, to capture that in story form so that people can even though it's complicated, even though it's subtle and it's hidden, we try to capture it in metaphorical form to illustrate it for people so that they can grok it intuitively. And then based on that intuition, we build the laws of our culture, so that they fit the intuition, which fits the lawfulness of nature. That's the stack of a mythos culture, an archaic culture. Richard, go ahead.
Like when you described like this kind of creative, like pregnant with possibility, like did the Greeks also kind of like similar to like Freud, which took this dichotomy kind of from the Greeks, like contrasting like the eros and the thanatos drives and instincts, like is it very similar to how the Greeks, also kind of framed it?
What's interesting about Freud is that he's looking at the Greeks and he's seeing the radicalness of them, how they strike to the roots of things. And he's attempting to capture it in his system. Sometimes he captures it well and sometimes he captures it badly. But you can always see what he's trying to do. He's sort of like Nietzsche that way. Nietzsche's hit and miss. But when Nietzsche's a hit, he hits it out of the ballpark. And even when he's a miss, he's an interesting miss. And Freud's the same way with his eros and thanatos. He's onto something there, but he's still trying to segment things through an excluded middle into clearly delineated intellectual ideas, because he's a product of an Apollonian intellectualized society. So he's sort of translating a more gnosic view of the world into a more noetic one, which is better than not looking at it at all. So that's kind of where I come down on eros and thanatos on Freud. He's like, he's looking at the right ballpark. He's just not entirely capturing it. Okay, so how about Marianne Danana?
So I've been disturbed lately about our culture. And in order to understand it, I looked back and I thought of South Africa, because it's also based on racism and colonialism. Yes. And I had this image of like hyenas devouring the carcass of the earth.
Yes.
And I'm really disturbed, and I don't know how we can get a handle back on some kind of colonial culture that's based on, I don't know, destroying nature.
Yes. What strikes to the heart of the matter? Kenneth writes about that all the damn time. He's talking about that stuff. We'll come back. It'll be a recurring theme throughout all of these. So Anna, then Dowdy, then Sharon.
Hi guys. I'm sorry, but I actually have a meeting at 12, so I'm just gonna have to throw some things out and then leave.
Sure, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm
Fortunately, it'll be recorded.
In my outlook, I'm pretty much a Neoplatonist, so it is offensive to me to hear the ancient world trash like this. It is kind of hard to listen to, and I would just recommend that people do their own reading. Go ahead and dive into Parmenides. See what you find there.
Yes.
I'm not sure that you will find something that you would call a rationalist. It's not super obvious, but see what you see. Also true for Plato, particularly things like there are many dialogues that are very, very whacked out, very mythological, very
Yes.
not rational. So let's
It's so
not
worth
get,
reading, isn't it?
well, just be careful about, in the midst of trying to create categories, one does, one does create a lot of Procrustean bread.
You're right.
And trims the corners off of things that really should be there.
You're right. I'm oversimplifying. I am.
Yeah, I mean, it happens. That's the logos problem, really,
It
in a
is.
nutshell. But
It is.
going back to the comment about Karen Armstrong, I don't think she was referring to mythological culture. I think she was probably referring to Vikings, and also Mycenae and Minos and situations.
She wasn't. She was referring to the steppes and the Russian steppes.
Sure.
And
there are many situations where you have that happen, but most of mythological culture would have been before agriculture. So that's another thing that she probably wouldn't categorize as religion. Anyway, just make sure that we get our facts straight as far as what philosophers say and what the history is. And everybody.
Well, Karen Armstrong, can I debate with you a little bit? She actually felt like religion started with slaughtering meat because people would get sick if they didn't slaughter it right. So they had special people that ritualistically slaughtered meat, and they became agricultural. And then, but she was talking about the Russian steppes. I don't know.
And that's what I'm saying is that her idea of religion begins with agriculture. And I guess if we're talking about mythology, we have to go back to pre-agriculture as well. Does that make sense?
No.
Okay. I'm sorry, but I actually have a 12 o'clock meeting, and it's really ratty of me to throw a bunch of bombs and leave the room. But
no, it's fun. I'm glad you did. We'll come back to it.
I enjoy listening. There's a lot of stuff that goes past me that I would love to argue with, but because the content of the conversation is just so fertile, far be it from me to mess with a good process.
Thanks, Anna.
All righty.
Talk to you next week.
Okay.
All right, Dowdy, then Sharon, then James.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Awesome. Yeah, a couple quick questions. So actually, I wanted to throw a metaphor, and I want to see if it works going back to physis and logos. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, but sort of like language as language versus like the ability of us to put language in structure. So logos is like the natural structure that unravels when we speak, and like physis is like all these words just out in the ether. Is that a possible? I guess the second point is, and more to the whole, because I do love battling Kenneth Smith. Yes. When he's describing physis, and I'm assuming that physis is like the you have to have it in order for these other five to be. When he's describing this and like knowing our insignificance as individuals or a species on a planet that's like an anomaly as we think, and like insignificant itself, who's to say that we're sort of outside the unraveling of physis? Like I wonder this, especially when you're like we're thinking we can like stand in the river and build a dam and say, yes, look, we are stopping the natural order of things, but who's to say us building the dam isn't part of that natural order of things? Because it seems like we have to have some extreme objective, like, and we have those finite brains where we just can't see outside of ourselves.
Yes.
What would Kenneth Smith's or anybody else's response beyond that?
So let me take those one at a time real quick. One of them, the first one you brought up about the nature of logos and can it be expressed in the language, in the words and the way that we use them. I can answer that in a few minutes after we do the logos stack that corresponds to this mythos stack. And I think it'll become clear that it all depends on which logos you mean. There's a metaphorical relationship between the capital L logos of a mythos culture and the lowercase l logos of a logos culture. They're related to each other, but you also have to say which one you mean in order to answer what you said, true or false. It's like from one perspective, what you said is exactly right on the money, and that's how it is. And from the other perspective, it's like, no, it's the other way around. So it all depends, but we'll see in a second. But the second thing that you asked about was, say it again. Say it again, the second part.
Yeah, how like who are we to be able to say that word? Yeah.
Yes. So in the mythic conception of physis.
Can I quote from Ken Smith before you
please,
go? I mean, I think
go ahead, Dave.
A direct quote from the reading. He says,
beautiful.
As evolutionary, I'm on page 63, the last paragraph. As evolutionary biologists have come to understand, a brain simple enough to be exhaustively understood by itself would be too simple to be capable of thinking.
Yes.
So that answers your question directly there, Dottie. I think he agrees with you.
He does. He does. That the notion, the archaic Greek notion of physis includes everything. It includes all of it is physis, all of it together. There's not parts of it that aren't physis. And it's the sum total when we look at it that we can see the lawfulness in. It's possible to look at any piece in isolation from the whole and not see the pattern that it's part of. And then you might think that it's unlawful or arbitrary or artificial. But once you put it back into the whole picture and see its context, you can see where it came from and why it's, contributing to the physis. He has a, on this very question, Heraclitus has a great quote where he's talking about the way that people can become, by thinking noetically, we can become so detached from the actual conditions we live in that we're like sleepwalkers. And it's like we're not interacting with things the way they actually are. And the only way to explain it is that like we're not truly conscious. And to be truly conscious, we'd have to actually see the physis and see the lawfulness of it and figure it out and act in accordance with how it is. But then he says this funny thing, which goes right to what you said. He says, and yet even sleepwalkers are doing work in the world and they're part of the whole. Even when they're completely out of sync with how things truly are, they're still contributing.
May I ask a really quick follow-up question?
Sure.
Because this sort of goes into my whole like beef with Kenneth Smith throughout this whole piece is like, then wouldn't we be, it's like, even though we're in an anti-myth culture, how can we hold so much anger to that fact? It's like, how can we be, aren't we just, isn't the death of a phoenix and the subsequent rise, that space in between, part of the cycle of a phoenix? Or like, isn't the space between the words part of the words? And even if this myth is like Grimhild from Snow White and it doesn't follow anything good, isn't it still like a part of it? And I think this is like, because we're all a part of nature, then like this myth is the total unraveling of the species, and we can't like necessarily fight against it in the same instance we can't fight against nature. I hope that is coherent.
It's the perfect question, and it's what we're going to talk about in just a second. It's the core point of this whole thing. So thank you for putting your finger on it. It's going to take more than just a little bit to answer though. So we'll expand into that. Sharon, you had your hand up.
I'm going to take a pass because I think, yes, let me contemplate some more.
Okay. And somebody else had their hand up a few minutes ago. Oh, Richard, go ahead.
Oh, it wasn't, but I'm just going to plant the seed, and it doesn't have to be an answer now, but more just kind of long-term trajectory. My little bit of a curiosity, and this is speaking out of ignorance, but I'm not that familiar with Derrida. But as we continue forward with a study, like I would like to understand if how comparable and contrastable like Derrida's critique of logocentrism is in like with respect to Kenneth Smith.
I think that by the time we get through these essays, we'll be in a good position to do something like that. Because of course the trick is to make sure that we can represent this worldview in our head separately from our normal review, and then separately from other people's worldviews, to be able to hold them and turn them at each other without warping any of them, so they can each speak for themselves. So we're partway there now. We're partway to seeing what Kenneth is describing as the archaic Greek worldview. And once we're comfortable with it, then it'll be safe to put it up against another one and see what they say about each other. But until then, we sort of have this risk that we would warp one of them to fit the other. And then one of them therefore becomes the primary and the other one becomes just a paper tiger version of itself and not the real thing. So that's my theory. So it's taken me most of an hour, but we've come to the point where I can answer Sharon's question about logos.
Yes.
And to answer the question, we go to the diagram in process instead of the one that I showed you guys before, where I'm still adding things. But the idea hinges on these two different modes of thinking, gnosis versus noesis, right? So gnosis is the sensitive, tasteful approach to thinking in which you don't let your noesis get very far away from the concrete evidence of reality. You insist that it stays hooked into the nature of things. And it is difficult because that means you're dealing a lot with the excluded middle. You're dealing a lot with murky things that are neither clearly true nor clearly false. So they don't give you a clear, simple answer a lot of the time. And as a result, it's easy to make the mistake of thinking that because they don't give you a clear answer, they must not be valuable. This question, is it valuable to work in the murk? Or must we avoid the murk and get to the precise crystalline clarity of noetic thought? This is what separates gnosis from noesis. Gnosis is willing to keep working in that murky area. And the reason is because most of nature is unknown to us. It is murky. If we're trying to understand the deep principles of the world, we're not going to find it in simple logical syllogisms. We're going to find it deep underneath the patterns of the world. And our initial versions of it are going to be crude and clumsy and sound stupid, even if they're more accurate than some other more precise version. There's a line in Aristotle where he attacks Plato over this issue. And he says, Plato loves precision. And Plato believes that precision is accuracy. He says, but it's a sign of, and these are Aristotle's words, it's a sign of poor breeding, a poor upbringing, to mistake precision for accuracy. Just because you're more precise doesn't mean you're more accurate. You could be very precise and clear, but wrong. And he feels that's something that Plato didn't really understand, but that the archaic Greeks did. Sharon and then Phil.
Isn't that what, and this is just from my understanding, at the beginning of 4.3, is that what Heraclitus talks about when he talks about the melding of the two?
I have so much ready for you guys on Heraclitus. Once we've answered your first question, I'd like to. I have so much good Heraclitus stuff here ready for you.
Okay.
Look at these notes. I am ready to go.
But I'm listening to you, and then the things I notice, but I don't understand.
Yes.
Float to the surface.
Yes. We'll come right to your question. That's the main entree I've prepared for today is to answer that question. Phil, you have your hand up.
Yeah. Relating to this topic, I want two things to say. One was, I need to complete slightly what Herbie Hancock said. He also praised Miles Davis for not making it clear. Right?
Yes.
These are the butter notes. And because he knew that if he made it clear what it means, that would be a direction for him to do.
Yes.
But he left it for him to interpret.
Yes.
To find out for himself. So that's one. That seems to be striking exactly what you're saying.
Yes.
The other thing is, like, I could see how individuals could get out of this trap, but part of the problem is that if we have a culture that's, depending how you look at it, seep into a structure,
yes,
for at least 500 years,
yes,
maybe 2,500 years,
right,
and that everybody has been sort of so inculcated with this,
yes,
I would say brainwashed in a sense. How do you expect society as a whole to awaken enough? Now, I could see individuals awakening.
Yes.
But for society to awaken, particularly when society actually also trained to forget those parts.
Yes.
Things, right?
Yes.
So how does it translate into a kind of sociological illumination?
And now you're pulling a Sharon and putting your finger right on the core thing of all of Kenneth Smith's philosophy is addressing that question right there. Mm-hmm. This is a massive problem, and this is the thing that is difficult about Kenneth Smith, is that he's not giving us a small, finite problem that's easy to tackle that gives us a little recipe for what to do next. What he's trying to make sure we see is just how amazingly, profoundly off-center we are, and how much enormous energy and momentum has been invested in that direction, so that we understand what we should not do next is try to hurl ourselves against it as though it's just a door we can break down, because it's more like a planet spinning. And adjusting it is going to require more than some simple individual heroic action. That we are going to have to get organized and figure these things out and build a movement in order to transform things. This goes beyond something that an individual can finish, but an individual can certainly start it. And it's part of what's interesting about his philosophy is that most philosophies are either all about the movement or all about the individual. Whereas his is saying you have to start with the individual, because if you can't see clearly, nothing you do is going to be clear thereafter. But once you see clearly, you're not done. You're like, there's not, and then victory, right? There's no immediate next step that follows from that except to build a movement of other people who can understand it and see it, and who together can come up with the creativity and the momentum to begin to make shifts. So it's interesting that way. Sharon.
Well, I want to respond to something that Phil said, because I'm a jazz fan too, and Herbie Hancock and Miles Davis really strike a good chord.
Yes.
But he said, you said Miles Davis told Herbie Hancock, forget about the butter notes, and he didn't explain it to him. He just wanted him to find the challenge and try to figure it out. And I don't know if this is cultural. I was raised in a family of 3 girls. And I remember I got to about 25, 24, 23, and I was qualified, and so were my other sisters. And our father called us in, and he said to us, I've given you the very best I can, which is a great education. He says, the rest is yours. He says, when I'm dead, I'm not leaving anything, because I've equipped you to meet the challenge of life. And so when you're saying that, Phil, I hear him speaking. He's been dead for about 30 years, but I hear him speaking. And personally, what that has given me is a drive, a curiosity. I'm telling you that this technology is not leaving me behind, because that's part of my nature. Yes. I am going to get it. And so, yes, you start with the individual, but sometimes it's overwhelming.
Yes.
Because the societal influences are so powerful that you you get squished.
Yes. That's right. That's right. So what you can see here with the split between gnosis and noesis is that if you want to engage in gnosic thinking, if you want to develop a mythos from which you could derive the laws of a culture that are aligned with society, you're going to spend a lot of time doing creative things, poetic things, artistic things, musical things, because you're trying to find some way to bring into expression ideas that we've never said before and that we don't have language or thoughts for. You're dealing in the murk, the complicated, confusing things, and trying to figure out how to put them in their most eloquent form so that they can be seen and understood for the first time. You're bringing darkened parts of the cosmos into the light where we can look at them and talk about them and go, oh, is that a thing? Should we be paying attention to that because we didn't know? You know, like the ability to see the ozone hole transformed us and made it possible for us to start putting in place policies to heal the hole in the ozone layer. But before most human beings had ever visualized the ozone layer or the hole in the ozone, they couldn't get excited about fixing it because it was an imaginary, abstract idea to them. This making tangible the things that are important but invisible is at the core of mythos, because that's how you get a culture aligned with the things that matter, even the things that matter that we can't see or didn't know about before. So where we get into trouble is if we answer that question differently and decide that we don't like the murk. We don't trust subjectivity. We don't like feelings. We want a clear crystalline world of logical deductions. We want to make our systems provable, right? Rigorous is the word that's used by intellectuals. The desire for rigor leads us away from reality, because reality is rigorous in its own terms, but we don't know what those terms are. So it's not rigorous for us. Right? We can't be rigorous about murky things we don't understand. So instead, we start postulating, and I haven't drawn it here, a stack of reality above noetic thinking. That's our models and our systems. It's our intellectual ideas. It's the, quote, reality that's in our heads instead of the actuality that's outside of our heads. And it's a systematic reality. That's what noesis postulates. For example, a system of laws, What are the laws of this country and how do they work? Or a money-based economy is noetic because you can add and subtract the numbers. You can calculate the interest. It feels precise. It feels objective. It feels trustworthy because it gives you solid answers, right? You could see why each of us on this call, we wouldn't even be here if we hadn't gone a certain distance down the noetic rabbit hole, right? Philosophy, somebody who's deeply immersed in immediacy like an infant can't be philosophical. You have to be questioning reality and yourself and the nature of things. You have to have gone a certain ways. So each of us know, whether we like it or not, whether we follow it or not, each of us knows that appeal of the rigorous analytical coherent system. We love it when a thing comes together so that it all seems to make sense. We want things to make sense. We want things to be logical. Even those of us who rebel against it, even those of us who say, I'm a creative and I'm not going to be a slave to my logic, I'm going to do these counter-logical creative things, you can feel the force you're pushing off against. And you know that if you weren't consciously deciding to do that, some part of you has been trained by this culture to slide back into it because it's the path of least resistance. Follow the law, earn your money, right? Consume your products. We have all of these organized, systematic roads to follow, and it's easy to follow them. That's what happens to noetic thinking. Noetic thinking postulates an easier reality than the complicated, confusing actuality we live in. And in that more coherent reality, using our noesis, we can draw conclusions about the lowercase logos of that reality. Right? Because we designed that reality according to systems of thought. So it has a nice, tidy logos, a built logos, a constructed reality, a systematic reality. And based on that, in turn, such as the enlightened self-interest or the reasonable person theory, or all of these idealized forms that we use in politics and economics, based on that, we can make the laws for our culture. But at this point, the culture that we've built and the laws that we've built, they're not grounded in the actual world. They're grounded in our imaginary reasonable person or our imaginary average person or in our imaginary enlightened self-interest. They're grounded in this postulated, intellectualized, false reality that's tidy and it gives us clean results when we apply noesis to it. And as a result, that's where the disconnect happens. And this is to address what Dowdy was saying, where what we are building may resemble a culture and it may fill in the holes in ourselves that desperately crave a culture and need a culture. What it's actually given us is saccharin instead of sugar. It's given us things that momentarily satisfy the need, the drive, without actually plugging us into the actual world. And so it becomes easier and easier for us to live simple, well-organized lives that nevertheless destroy, for example, the worldwide climate without us ever knowing we're doing it, because we've become detached from reality. We're now pointing at our own self-destruction without ever realizing it. And the paradox, to answer what Dowdy brought up, the paradox is this capacity for us to be so disconnected from reality that our own efforts are destroying the things that we depend upon is a natural capacity that evolved within us to do a profoundly unnatural thing, to destroy ourselves. Most species have evolved in such a way that they sustain themselves, right? As part of the larger whole, they fit. But our great breakthrough evolutionarily was this abstract intellect that gives us the capacity to do what the other animals don't do, which is to naturally destroy ourselves and everything else. It's a paradox. So, finally answering Sharon's question, logos. There are two logoi. Mm-hmm. There's the logos that is the replacement for mythos that we use as the lawfulness from which we derive logos-based laws, nomoi, and our logos-based anti-culture, which is grounded in the fake intellectual reality. And then there's the true logos that we're sort of aping when we do that, which is that the cosmos itself is clearly lawful, even though it's not expressed in any human language. And from a mythic perspective, it's our job to be chasing the uppercase logos, to try to learn about it all, and explore it and investigate it, even in murky ways, even in creative, artistic ways. And that's a non-logos culture thing to do, ironically. The reason that we have two terms for this, the reason it's important that this ambiguity and confusion be present linguistically, is that it's the whole problem with a logos culture. The whole problem with a logos culture is that its substitute reality is overlaid on top of actuality and hides it from us. That its made up logos, its intellectualized logos, is laid over on top of the actual logos, which lets us forget that we're not talking about the real world, we're just talking about the imaginary one that we've created systematically. It's fulfilling for us the place that the actual natural logos fulfills in the world, so that we organize ourselves according to what we think is reality, except it's not actually reality. It's a different lawfulness, an artificial one that we invented. Sharon.
So the mini logos is supportive of our myth, of the myth.
Which logos is?
The mini logos, the smaller logos. The main logos, the big one you have is the real one. And then the mini logos is the one that we have invented to explain the world in which we live.
Yes.
So my question is that it's supportive of the myth, is it? I don't know.
It's a replacement for the myth.
Anti-myth.
A replacement.
It's a kind of anti-myth. It's where we say, well, we don't need myths because myths are murky, right? We can use the precision of logoi, and our logoi make it so that we don't need myths anymore. That's what we tell ourselves. We say myths are for primitive people, but we're more sophisticated than that. So we can dispense with myth, and we'll just have, Richard Feynman's theories for how you calculate quantum state changes. And in doing so, we find ourselves with things that give us explanatory utilitarian value without actually making us understand or feel at home in the cosmos. I'll come to you in a sec, Phil. James had his hand up first.
So basically, you're saying that the kind of logos on the right has kind of like skipped over or fabricated a sense of being outside of nature, right? Or above,
yes.
Or split in such a way that you say one part of nature is subordinate to the other part, and so you kind of like and then somebody like Spinoza comes along, or even the Stoics, they had this idea of God as not something transcendent but eminent in their being, in nature itself. Yeah, someone like Spinoza comes with this new idea to bring God back, or the idea of the divine substance back into the eminence of nature, and the Jewish community excommunicates him. And it's kind of like it's sort of like and Socrates is a mouth Plato basically, in which he in the Credo he justifies taking the hemlock, for all these different reasons. Basically, he's saying that there is the laws of a state, and there is this permanent soul that he believes in that transcends his natural life.
Yes.
He doesn't mention anything like amor fati, that he's kind of
right
his fate. He just kind of like it jumps over that idea that there is no such thing as death, right?
Right.
And that he's positing this permanence of the soul and the laws and the state to justify taking the hemlock.
Yes.
Or more or less, in other respects, in other situations, they might say, well, he's taking a Kool-Aid.
Yes.
Yeah, sort of like that. And so it's kind of like it's a beginning of the logocentrism and religion and the Christian idea of a transcendent God.
It was drawn on heavily and deliberately by Augustine. I mean, Augustine said what he was doing. Right. He said, I'm going to Plato and Socrates and I'm pulling this stuff in, and this is going to be my cosmology for how Christianity works. And he just basically said he was going to do it. Mm-hmm. And then what you see with Thomas Aquinas is Aquinas growing up inside the Augustinian Christianity that's Neoplatonic, he's trying to find a way to allow us to talk about nature in a way that's not considered a heresy by the established medieval church at that point. So what he does is he repurposes Aristotle to focus on Aristotle as a successor to or follower of Plato. And in doing so, he wedges open a little bit of opening to allow us to talk about nature. And he says, well, if nature was created by our creator, then if we want to understand our creator, we have to be able to look at nature because those are his fingerprints. This is all Thomas Aquinas stuff. And he's using that to introduce a little bit of naturalism into the medieval worldview. But what he finds, the limits that they set for him, is that he's only allowed to do that so long as the end of every logical syllogism is to come back to God is the source of all meaning and the creator of all things. Right. He's not allowed to follow any line of thought that leads anywhere else. Right. And so you get that kind of scholasticized version of naturalism, where naturalism, as long as it stays in the box, is okay, but if it goes outside the box, we burn you at the stake. And that became the sort of naturalism of the medieval era.
So isn't Kant continuing that tradition?
Yes.
With the pure form of rationality, that
yes.
somehow, rationality is pure and its nature is subordinate to that.
Yes. Anytime somebody does that, anytime somebody puts reason or God or man over nature, they're engaging in a noetic behavior. They're abstracting away from the actual circumstances we find ourselves in to postulate a purer, cleaner, more perfect set of assumptions from which noesis gives them better results.
Right.
And it's because they're so committed to noesis that they can't stand to deal with subject matter that doesn't fit it well. And so they just suppress that subject matter as imperfections or reflections or details or ceteris paribus, right? In science, the fundamental principle that we don't talk about very often, all else being equal, right? The in vitro laboratory situation that we create is itself an abstraction and artificial. And as a result, it pushes us out of a gnosic worldview and into a noetic worldview.
Also, the Kant's empirical imperative is sort of like the law.
Yes.
That you must obey, and it's sort of like premise on a divine, notion of what law is, right?
Yeah. I'm going to call on Marianne in just a second, but to finish what you're saying, James, one of the measures of this is that if we look at the Constitution of the United States and our legal system, we have a complex legal system, right? Everybody knows it's so complex at this point that if you're not a lawyer, you don't know most of it. And in fact, even if you are a lawyer, you don't know most of it. You're going to be a specialist in the law, and you're going to know one area of the law. And even in that one area of the law, you still don't know it all. You just know a lot of it. You can find your way around, and you know how to locate the rest of it. And so you're working inside of this giant labyrinth of the law. So you'd think with all of these laws, surely we'd have some foundational principle that said, anytime the law is out of sync with the way things actually are, the law is wrong, right? Wouldn't you want your laws to be based in reality? Shouldn't there be some fundamental check on the law that says if it's irreal, then it's non-binding? But in fact, there's not, because the law doesn't care about the actual world. It only cares about the perfect crystalline world that it itself has been constructed according to. And so it's completely abstracted. And that's what makes it an anti-culture, is that it's instead of connecting us to reality and making us well fitted to it, it's disconnecting us from reality, making us well fitted to our own civilization at the expense of our civilization being ill fitted to reality, so that we end up destroying our culture and driving animals to extinction and committing genocide and slavery and all those other horrible things that we do as a result of being disconnected from the consequences. Marianne, go ahead.
It's more important for for a government to be based on putting people in authority who
yes.
Who know what the good is, rather than to know what the law is.
Yes, that's right.
I think I just had this moment of big capital logos and small logos, because I was going, law is based on the common law of England to protect the manor houses.
Yes.
Yes. And I was just in this little L logos. But what I also wanted to ask is, I think the more I learn about some philosophers like Kant, I think that they disassociate from time because they don't want to age.
Uh-huh.
Hmm.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah, there is this fear of corruption. You can almost, once you start to see this distinction between Verstand and Begriff, it will be between noesis and gnosis, and between the kinds of mentalities that generates and then the kinds of cultures people of that mentality create together. After a while, once it's clear, you can smell it. Like really, it's really easy to smell. When someone talks about purity and trying to avoid contamination, you know they're in a Verstand, noetic mode of thought, because noesis depends upon the excluded middle, which requires purity, whereas gnosis and Begriff deal with the world as it actually is, even when it's messy and complicated. And so, I hate immigrants because they pollute my perfect population is a noetic thing to say or think or feel even. Whereas, bringing in people as they actually are, wherever they come from, is the way the world works. And we have to deal with the people who actually come here and not pretend that they're not or just try to shove them all out, is an inherently more gnosis Begriff approach to the problem of immigration. One of them is seeking purification and abstraction, and one of them is saying, let's deal with the world as it actually is. So there's what we think of as a political split is right here, deep in the different mindsets and the different ways of thinking about the world, which means these are both capacities we're born with. So Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, when I was teaching at Penn State 35 years ago, I had teacher Alfonso Lingas. Although he wasn't doing it directly, I realized that he taught me more about Impressionism than all the art historians. And it was a particular time when he spoke. He's kind of a very poetic philosopher. And he said, and I guess he used the Heideggerian language. He says,
yes,
as Dasein hammers the nail pierces the shingle. The shingle attaches itself to the roof. The roof sits in the house rests on the foundation rests on the plot. The plot is resting on the neighborhood grid, and that is rested on the city grid, which is connected to the state system, which then is connected to the nation, which is connected to the continent, and the continent is connected to the world. The world is spinning around in the solar system, and the solar system sits in the galaxy, and the galaxy sits in the universe. And he said, with that understanding, Dasein knows everything. He said, however, it is also true that as Dasein strikes the nail, he feels the weight of the hammer.
Yes.
And he feels the sun beating down on his body,
yes,
his skin. And he feels the wind blowing across his sweat and the coolness. He hears the birds singing and the color of the sky,
yes,
the leaf rustling. He said, that is also a world in which Dasein lives. And so immediately I understood that he was actually talking in a way about Impressionism, although that wasn't his intent, because that's exactly what Impressionism is about describing your experience in the world and being in that experience rather than being descriptive of the world, right? Is to be in it and feel it. And he, in his way, was of course trying to recuperate this, in his way, this whole mytho culture in which, in a sense, Dasein, in this particular way, has been separated from, right? And he said, of course, that is part of the truth, but that we've forgotten about the other part of the truth, right? So
that's right.
It was beautiful. I'm sure I'm not doing justice to it, but it was beautiful the way he explained it, because he wasn't trying to kick logos out totally. He was just saying,
exactly,
we can't forget about this other thing in which we actually exist and experience the world.
Exactly.
As it happens. And I hope that will help you when you look at an Impressionist painting, right?
Yes.
Because it's about experiencing the world, right?
because the experience matters, right? The experience has a concreteness that gives it a truth that no abstract idea is capable of. All abstract ideas, by definition, are separated from the truth, even when they're trying to model it. Sharon, go ahead.
One of the great things about this group is I like to hear all these philosophical experts, because I just find the reading fascinating. And so I go back to the beginning of the section when he talks about Heraclitus, and then Kenneth Smith goes into the Aristoi, the Dualoi, and the Banusoi, and he talks about how they experience this logos and mythos differently. And that I found fascinating, because I think in a society you have a spectrum or a multiplicity of people, and their different behaviors make up the society. This is how I see it fundamentally. So could you just expound on that part there?
Yeah.
And
yeah, so that was the whole reason I spent time on that diagram, is so that we could do this. Once again, Sharon, you're lobbing the ball right over the plate for me.
that's basic intelligence. That's all it is.
So he's the reason that there are three different mentalities, the Dualoi, Banusoi, and Aristoi, in the archaic Greek conception of human nature, is that we are born with two different mental faculties that lead us to tend to caricature ourselves into one or the other of those two faculties, unless we struggle to reconcile them and synthesize a third one out of them. And that gives us the three, right? Two of these faculties are what come easily to us. And Dualoi, to be a doulos is the easiest thing to do. And that's to just really stay closely connected to one's own immersive experience of life and one's own feelings about life, and to not question it, and to assume you're probably right? If I'm angry, that guy probably really is bad. But if I'm happy, then maybe he must really be good, right? That my feelings are absolutely accurate. And if I look at something and it looks a certain way, it must really be that way, right? My perceptions must correspond to reality. This is the Dualic worldview, and it's easy to see why it's appealing, because if you don't question yourself, you can have a great deal of confidence about your life, right? I mean, wouldn't it be great if we were seeing things as they actually are, and if our feelings were really always appropriate and guiding us to do the right thing? And my mom went through a pretty serious hippie stage. Any stereotype you've heard about hippies, she went through that at some point. And she used to tell me that she believed that if your body were deficient in some nutrient, that you would naturally become hungry for that nutrient. And that meant that your appetites could be trusted. If you wanted something, you probably needed it and you should have it. And on the one hand, that's like half right. We did evolve to survive, and we do have appetites, and there's a reason we feel these feelings we do. But on the other hand, it's also wrong, because it sets you up for addiction and for being misled by optical illusions, emotional illusions, cognitive illusions. To assume there's no such thing as being wrong sets you up to be wrong a lot, because it means when you're wrong, you're not going to learn from yourself. You'll just instead try to suppress the evidence that you were wrong, or to forget about it afterwards as quickly as you can, to go back to having that confidence. This is what happens when you're stuck in a Dualic mode. Richard, you got your hand up.
I can't remember when, like in a previous session, when like I think just wanted to relate to this or add on to this, like you were contrasting these three ways of thought and these three classes. Okay, like it's sort of like you were saying, like kind of in itself or of itself or something.
Yes.
Yes. It's a lot more stuff here, so
here it is. Hegel, the Geist.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah.
So the Dualic mode engages a lot in Begriff style thinking, which is characterized by two things. One is that it's particular and concrete. It gives you a lot of truth value and a lot of rich detail, but at the cost of only being about a particular situation and not being generally applicable. And it makes you feel at home in the world, because the mode of thought is what he calls Ansichsein, or being in itself.
Being in itself, yes.
You are in your own skin, you are in your own feelings, you are in your own world, and you're comfortable there. You belong there. Right?
That's the Dualic.
That's the Dualic mode. But it's full of limitations that we all know about. We all know about them because, you know, we all had to overcome them. We get tired of being hungry and not being able to do anything about it. We get tired of pooping ourselves. We get tired of being humiliated because we just told everybody something that they all knew was false and we didn't know it. And now they're all pointing and laughing because we were wrong. So we begin to distance ourselves from our body and our feelings and our naive experience and our naive ideas. And we try to create some safety for ourselves, some insulation, so that we're not such live wires, so that we've got protection. And we start theorizing about ourselves and our circumstances and our feelings to try to relate to them in a way that's less a slave of them and more the master of them.
I picked that up and it went on the floor.
James, you got your hand up.
Oh yeah, have you, you know, according to this Deleuze, this French philosopher, he pointed out that that the problem with Hegel is his emphasis on the negative that drives the dialectic.
Yes.
And that, you know, if a truer conception of nature or the process of this, you know, this natural process is that it's not driven by a negative force, but is a positive force, you know.
Yes.
And you know, I wonder if you agree with that.
It's both at the same time. And I would agree that in trying to make it clear that it's a dialectic, Hegel overemphasizes the negative. There's a lot of negative involved, but the negative is to achieve a positive. You know, it's like, I don't like those things. I don't want to be those things. I want to be something else. I want to do something else. I want to be proud of myself. I want to be right more often. I want to be able to feed myself when I'm hungry. I want to be able to stay clean. I want to be able to plan for the future. All of these things that I want require me to separate myself from myself, to see myself as a subject matter, and to be able to theorize, and to be able to postulate a possible future world, or maybe several possible future worlds, and to choose among them which one I want to try to create. So anything about planning or making things better inherently has some Verstand qualities to it. We wouldn't be capable of doing these things without Verstand. Enormous good comes from moving to Verstand. And what's happening in Hegel is that he's responding to Kant, who held up Verstand as the ultimate and only goodness. And so he focuses on the negative to try to rebalance Kant, but in doing so, as the commentator that you mentioned, James, points out, he sort of emphasizes the negative too much. So for Verstand, you move into a mode of being for itself, where, you know, you have decided what you want to be. You're no longer inhabiting your skin completely. You're now sort of at a remove from yourself, and you're deciding for yourself what you want. What do you want to think? What do you want to feel? How do you want to live? And in doing so, you abstract yourself from reality, but you also universalize your thinking. You now have the ability to talk about, you know, all Germans, or all Black people, or all dinners in the future, right? It's not just used for bigotry and prejudice. It's also used for creating scientific laws, right? The same Verstand activity is what lets us say every time an object is falling, the same rules apply. It's not different every time, right? I don't have to treat each one as a one-off. I can start to generalize. So you get that universality, but it comes at the cost of abstraction. And so you gain more power at the same time you become more disconnected from reality. And that's the pros and the cons of Führersichtsein. And part
that's
of
the Banusoi, right?
That's the Banusoi. Yeah.
Banusoi. Okay.
Yeah, the Banusoi is the person who is so proud of having escaped the Dualic worldview. There's a lot to be proud about there, right? I'm not such a fool for my own opinions and feelings, and I can think beyond that. I've distanced myself from that immediate foolishness, and now I can make choices about my life. And also, using Verstand and noesis, a Banausos can rise to the top of hierarchies, right? I can not just, you know, hammer on a piece of wood. I could become a master craftsman. I can make astonishing works of wood craftsmanship or metal craftsmanship. I could be an amazing programmer. I could be an amazing doctor, because I'm able to think systematically and organize it and organize myself, you know, so that I succeed within these systems that have been built around it. There's a lot to be desired there. It's just that, as Sharon mentioned on previous calls, most of us are some kind of, we're not pure Banausoi. To be a Banausos noesis acts like a strange attractor for us, like a gravity well. We move all around it. It's just we keep coming back to it and we keep orienting to it. And it's the same with Dualoi. All Dualoi have some Verstand. They all have some noesis. Otherwise, they'd be pooping themselves, right? They have created some distance from themselves. But when they try to figure out what feels comfortable or natural, what do they trust? What they trust is they trust their immediate experience and their feelings more than they trust abstract ideas. You think too much is what a doulos tells a Banausos. You get lost in your head. You're too disconnected from reality. These are Dualic things to say to a Banausos. Even though they themselves engage in a whole bunch of that kind of thinking, it's always pointing back towards their feelings and their appetites and their immediate experience of life and what they have personally experienced, their parochial view of the world. So Hegel pits them against each other, contrasts them with each other, shows how Verstand arises from within Begriff naturally as its antithesis, and then shows how they're antithetical to each other. They resist each other, how people push themselves into one or the other strange attractor, typically for much of their lives. Even when we learn how to role play the other one and use it in certain parts of our life, our comfort zone will always be one side or the other, because the two are just, they don't like each other. They express each other in a worldview and a mentality that's hostile and antagonistic. The Banausos is all about having escaped the doulos, right? Verstand is all about, I am not a prisoner of my feelings. And a doulos is all about, I am plugged into my feelings. I'm plugged into life. I'm not going to be one of those airy-fairy pie-in-the-sky people. I actually deal with tangible reality. And so as a result, they each magnify the deficiencies of their own mode in your life. Whatever mode you're in, you tend to make the stereotypical characteristic mistakes of that mode over and over and over. Even though we're all individuals, and we are in the details, in the overall pattern, moderns all make the same kinds of mistakes over and over because we're all so Banausic, we're so Verstand. Or the people who are pushed down into a Dualic mode, who resist that, who say, I don't want to climb the social ladder if it means I have to be disconnected from my feelings. They make a whole different set of characteristic mistakes, right? The Darwin Awards. It's not that every Darwin Award winner is a Banausos, but Lordy, over 90% of them are. It's the people who couldn't plan ahead. And they just said, I want money. The bank has money. I'm going to break into the bank, and now I've locked myself in the vault. Who could have foreseen this? What a tragedy. Except all the Banausoi are laughing at them, because the Banausoi are like, I would never do that. It's so Dualic to do that, to be so immersed in your appetite at the moment that you don't see where you're going. You know what I mean? We know these types exist. We just don't have language for them. We don't have ways of thinking about them coherently. We try to chalk it up to which political party you're in, or whether you're educated, or all these sort of incidental things we try to use to characterize these modes, but none of them is right on the money. James, go ahead.
Yeah, could you say something about Hegel's notion of the absolute? Is that a mythos, or some version of a conceptual version of mythos?
So, yeah, he uses some funny language here to try to talk about this, but what he's saying is there is an actual world with actual nature that follows actual laws. Like, he has ingested Heraclitus and that archaic Greek world, but he himself grew up in a Verstand culture, an Apollonian, a noetic culture, and so he's expressing these things and using very abstract terms. But the fact that he's using abstract terms shouldn't blind us to the fact he's actually trying to talk about concrete reality. So his notion of the absolute is as close as he can make it to saying what the Greeks meant by physis. There is a cosmos out there. It is lawful according to its own laws and not according to ours. It is a whole, where he says the truth is the whole over and over. He says to abstract is to be in error. So he's trying to warn us that, the danger of Verstand is that we disconnect ourselves from the whole. We stop seeing the whole picture. We start just seeing the little pieces we've abstracted out and systematized into our organization. And as we do that, we distance ourselves from the absolute. Right. Our ideas become universal, but they become abstract. And so the reconciliation that he prescribes for us is that by regaining the strengths of Begriff and combining them with the strengths of Verstand, when we try to put them together, we find that they're antagonistic. And the only way to do it is to come up with this new third mode of thought, which is implicit in us, which evolution made possible in us, but which it's very easy to go through our lives without ever engaging in, because you have to work for it to get there.
Just a quick question.
Phil.
How do I get this text?
So the text is, not these diagrams, but the text is where I was putting the link in the meetup invite. And what I'll do is I'll do an update to that document that puts these in an appendix, so that we can keep coming back to them.
So Hegel's absolute is a kind of a divine nature then?
Yeah, it was hard for Hegel because he didn't want to give up his Christianity, and his Christianity still had a lot of medievalism in it. And so Hegel, at the same time that he's trying to be more concrete, is nevertheless also abstract in many ways. And so when he's trying to reconcile nature and God, he can't quite get there. He sees that he needs to, but he does it in a very left brain way. It would be left to later people to work harder to try to shove the divine and nature back together again the way they were for the archaics.
So he's kind of like making Spinoza's idea of nature and God a kind of a dynamic dialectic.
Yeah, there's some relationship there. You're right. He's working in that same area, trying to rediscover what the archaic Greeks knew, which is that nature, by being all-encompassing and coherent, is also the source of the sacred, that the gods must arise immanently. And Hegel could never reconcile that with the individual abstracted creator God who existed before the cosmos that he inherited with everybody else. So he got stuck on that struggle. I don't think he ever got finished, but at least it's the same material Spinoza's working. Phil.
Yeah, it seems to me the way I deal with it is the idea of equivocation. I got this idea actually through basketball, right?
Yeah.
And the thing about basketball is like, you need to be near the basket because, you get the ball and that's when you get a slam and jam, okay? The problem is there's a rule that you can't be there for more than 3 seconds.
That's right, because the game would be boring if everyone just stood under their basket blocking all the time.
Exactly. So therefore, you must, in the real world, learn how to equivocate between the borderlines.
Yes.
In and out. Okay.
Yes.
Balance.
I don't have a third ideal state that somehow balances two, but the equivocation allows you to be in the borderlands.
Yes.
In a sense, incorporate the two and fold them together. And maybe that never gets to a resolution, but it gets you, in a sense, a taste of both, and in some ways, a kind of balance between.
That's right. That's right. Before we can develop Vernunft, the third type that he postulates, we first have to realize that there's problems with both Begriff and Verstand, and then we have to start wrestling in our own lives with how do we not be a prisoner of one or the other. And the first way to do that is to equivocate and to say, I'm going to make myself switch back and forth based on what I think helps the most here. And so you can see people who were raised in a very intellectual way, but turn away from it to re-engage with art and music and poetry. And they force themselves to reconnect with their dreams and their feelings and anything else that they think will help them reattach to Begriff, right? They don't have the word for it. They don't know the word Begriff. And they don't have the conception of how exactly these two modes of thought work. But they have a general idea that it's problematic to be stuck all mathematicized and intellectualized all the time, and that it's disconnecting you from things that really matter. And so they struggle and they move back and forth. And in that struggle, they gain the ability to not be stuck all the time in one of them. And once you have that ability, it becomes possible to postulate a third mode of thought, even if you can't get there initially. You could start to see there's some other way that combines them. So I'm all with you, Phil. That's where we start. We start with that equivocation. But in this week and future weeks, we can take it further and show you what the third mode of thought looks like, What makes it different? Equivocation lets you sort of approximate it sometimes, which is powerful, incredibly powerful. But there's ways to actually get there. Richard, go ahead.
At first, I kind of winced when you used the word equivocate. I'm just kind of like looking it up here, and I'm looking at the Oxford dictionary definition here.
Yes.
Sorry. Okay. Equivocate. Use ambiguous language so as to conceal the truth or avoid committing oneself. And I think, yeah, you're meaning the latter.
The latter.
Where I think like all this time, like I still remember like Macbeth and then like Shakespeare writing about like equivocation, and that's more concealing the truth part. So it's sort of like when you use that word, it kind of just I know that's not what you meant, but it just sort of like rang alarm bells for me. But sorry.
Well, I'm glad it did, because this has to be talked about. Remember that logos cultures, Verstand cultures, noetic cultures, they don't trust the middle. They don't trust the murky, messy part in the middle. They want you to pick true or false. They want you to take a side. And so the very notion of not taking a side feels treacherous, like you're a backstabber, like you can't be relied upon. You won't commit yourself one way or the other. You're not loyal, and therefore your thinking is not rigorous and can't be relied upon. So there's a reason that equivocate both literally means that you're able to move back and forth between the two positions, but also emotionally feels like it's some kind of danger or threat, and we use it in that sense. So Phil, then Sharon.
Yeah, I actually mean it slightly differently.
Go ahead.
It's not just being in the ambiguity, but the equivocation to me involves a kind of a dynamic motion.
Yes.
In other words, it's an active motion in which you are put in a dynamic mode of being in the world that's constantly moving back and forth, so that you're not stuck in a particular position.
That's right.
The reason why I like equivocation, and I have maybe you'll convince me later, some trouble with this third category, is that I'm always suspicious of systems, any kind of system, right?
Yes.
And that even if there was a third that you're going to introduce to me to, I'll probably just have a more complex equivocation that moves in and out of the, of the not the circle, but now also the 3-point line. So in a sense, I will always be moving kind of like Steph Curry is moving, right? Because that's the essence of being in the world, is always, in a sense, allow yourself to be fluid and dynamic rather than static. That's what equivocation means to me. Is not get stuck.
Yes.
I'm going to quote, this is from a couple months ago, from studying Kenneth Smith in one of the earlier, another essay. I'm just looking at my notes here, sorry. Okay, I'm going to paste it to the...
Give me a couple words. I'm showing my screen. I can bring it up.
The chat here. I don't know. Okay. Whoops. I should put a line break there. I'm going to, I don't know how to pronounce it. Epoche. Sorry, how did you say it?
Epoche. The CH is like the H sound from German.
Is an ancient Greek term. In Hellenistic philosophy, it is a technical term typically translated as suspension of judgment, but also as withholding of assent. In the modern philosophy of phenomenology, it refers to the process of setting aside assumptions and beliefs. I'm not sure is that kind of very similar to what we're trying to...
Yes. That's what Phil's talking about, is that you're not committing yourself to be stuck in Begriff, and you're not committing yourself to be stuck in Verstand, but you have to gain that. We've talked about the dislocating the socket of the mind so that you can actually move between different sockets. That's what he's talking about here. And that's what the third mode of thought is about, is developing that facility and orienting it. Sharon, then James.
Could we substitute another word for equivocate? And this is just me being pragmatic. I'd call it situational adjustment. And that's how you move between the three characters that he has outlined here, the Aristoi, the Dualoi, and the Banisoi, because that's life. Different situations called for different behavior. And so when you...
I checked on your...
I think somebody needs to mute.
And so when you exist along a continuum, this is what I call survival adaptive behavior.
Yes. This is the distinction between these three modes, is that the Begriff mode doesn't move. And the Verstand mode, yeah, the Dualic mode hasn't moved. It's developed, but it mostly stays where in the live wire infant state. It just becomes a more sophisticated version of the live wire infant. Whereas the Banausic mode, the Verstand mode, has moved because it had to struggle out of the Dualic mode to create the Banausic mode. But the goal of its movement is to stop moving. It thinks, now I'm done. I've arrived at the truth. The truth is abstract and universal and mathematized. And now that I'm here, I don't want to go anywhere. Right? And so that's why he incurs his liabilities, is because he refuses to move back in the direction that disgusted him so much that he spent so long getting out of. He's like, he now has to turn the Dualic mode, the Begriff mode, into his scapegoat that he sweeps all of his own sins under. Says, oh, if that thing happened, somebody was too emotional. They were too subjective. They were too irrational, right? You hear this word irrational used endlessly. They weren't logical enough. Whereas in doing so, he's hiding the fact that reason and logic generate their own liabilities, and that by clinging to one side of his mental faculties, he's now incurring them to the maximal extent. Vernunft, the Aristic side, is different from the other two in that it is not about a destination. It's not about being stuck, and it's not about arriving. It's about doing neither and learning to move between different worldviews. So what Phil's talking about is that exemplifies the third mode of thought. The third mode of thought is the mode of thought that moves, and that refuses to be stuck somewhere, and that says that what is actually so is more important than what I think is so, and therefore, for every actual situation, there may be some mode of thought that's appropriate to that situation, but I don't necessarily know in advance which one is right. I might have to try a couple different things and find out what the best fit is. So there's this humility that's built into the heuristic mode that's completely missing from the other two, because an Aristos has to start from the position, I don't know, and the things that I don't know matter. And so I have to engage experimentally and fluidly, amphibiously. I have to be able to look at things from different angles. And even when I do my best, I still won't confuse that with the truth. It's just the best I was able to do so far. So like the saying goes, art is never completed, only abandoned, right? You move on to the next one, only because right now there's something else to do, not because you think you perfected it. James, go ahead.
Yeah, isn't this for itself and in itself the dualism that that's left that Descartes left us and
yes
continued with, and that it's working out in Hegel's dialectic.
Yes.
But it's that Heidegger later on felt that it was not completely resolved, and so he had to posit this Dasein as a phenomenological project, but it's also an interpretive hermeneutic project at the same time,
right?
Because you can never know the thing in itself, for what it is, without some interpretation of that appearance.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's operates. It's kind of like a back to what the experience is like. With nature, that it's in your use of the equipment. In nature, that gives you this experience of being, living in nature.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Phil, go ahead. You got your hand up.
Yeah, there's a good example of that in art. Since I'm an artist, I know about art. So
please.
Duchamp, one of his most important pieces is what's called the large glass. He actually has a different name for it. It is now in the Philadelphia Museum. And when he was shipped there for a show, when the curator opened it, the glass actually cracked. And of course, they were panicked. And they called up Duchamp, come take a look at it, ready to apologize, whatever. And Duchamp just sort of said, "It's even better."
Yeah, right.
It's even better. In other words, it even goes outside of his understanding, right? He was able to, and I was like, that ability to go outside of your own system is like,
Yes.
and recognize that, wow, it's not like now that you ruined it, I'm going to collect the money or whatever it is.
Right.
No, it's even better. So
Situational adjustment.
Yes. Yes. That's a brilliant example. Thank you, Phil. Ginny, go ahead.
So this is my thinking, Rick. Is it possible, actually, with David, since he's the organizer, is it possible to record these meetings on Mondays and have it on YouTube? Is it possible to do that?
He does that.
Oh, you do?
They're all on YouTube.
Can you share it?
So how do I look it up?
So maybe what we could start doing is we could share the link in the invite for the previous week. So for example, for this one, after it's done, after he posts it and we have the YouTube link, maybe we can just add it to the chats attached to this meeting invite. Then you could go back and look at it whenever you want to.
Yeah, but how about all the ones that I wasn't in?
No, we could do the same.
Okay.
Because he's posted them all on YouTube, so we could easily grab the links and put them in for each of these past weeks. And then you'd have an index.
What's the
so if I open up the email from that week and click the link from that email, I'll be able to look at it?
So what I'm thinking about is, this website here, Meetup.
Yeah.
And so if it's got the week 8 here and week 8's got the invite to the Zoom. So once he posts it on YouTube, down here in the comments section, we could just add a comment with a link and you could click on the link. And that way you could, if you wanted to see last week, you could go to the calendar for last week, click on it, and we would have posted the link. We haven't done that yet, but we can do that.
I think the comments is probably not so workable because this is posted over so many different groups, right? And so depending which one you're joining from. So maybe, but if it's maybe put into like the description that's copy and pasted, like just kind of the link to the YouTube channel, like
for the previous week, you think? Or to the channel.
Or just have, this is the YouTube channel, which has the episode.
Yes, we can do that.
Yeah.
We can do that.
And just out of curiosity, what is the YouTube channel that has everything?
It's Dave's own. It's under Dave's own name, I think.
Oh, cool.
So let's see if I can bring it up here. Mythos and Logos.
I think it's your second link on the page right there in front of you.
Oh, I went back. Oh, here we go. Nope. Let me go back. Yes.
Oh, we're being streamed right
live now. Right, look at this.
Oh.
I'm playing it.
So yeah, can you just drop that link in our chat and then we can navigate
to the David Royal.
But the chat disappears.
Just right now so I could bookmark it,
Yeah, let me grab this. So here's his channel. And I will go to the meetup and put it there. And then I will also put it in our chat, like you say. So let's go to the chat. Hello, more chat. Ta-da. Oh, he just did it. Okay. Yes, so they're there. So you can always go back and see the recording. So if you have to leave early, you can see the rest of the recording. Some weeks when I'm trying to prepare for these, I look at I watch the previous week's one, and I'm going to look for some specific thing to answer a question. I tell you, half the time I just end up just watching the whole thing because you guys are interesting. These are fun discussions.
A quick question.
Yeah.
I had promised to post my essay, but I didn't know how to do it. Could you go through that? I mean, how do I post it?
Oh, again, you can just email David. Email David and he'll distribute it to the group or give us a link to it. So do you have David's email?
No, I don't.
So Phil, like when you sign up for this meetup, like if you go to the meetup event and then you'll see the list of attendees, like David will be the organizer.
Mm-hmm.
And then
oh yeah, right at the top.
Then you can just send David a message.
I know, but it's too long for the message.
No, but like use the meetup messaging to exchange email addresses, okay. or you can just like just type it into the chat, into the Zoom chat. But I don't think you're even using the Zoom chat.
No, that's not the issue. The issue is how do I get it to everybody? Because we're talking about 20, 30, 40 people over the course of 17 different meetup groups.
Oh, it should just be a Google Drive link, I think, or something.
Yeah, that's the only thing you can do. Put it in your Google Drive, Phil.
Well, he just has it as a word processing document.
And then share it here. That's the only way to do it.
Well,
I'll give you my email address in the chat.
Okay.
And you can send it to me.
Right.
And then I'll send it to the group.
Okay.
So I'm Toad, TOAD at Eskimo.com.
Really?
Yeah, I've had that forever. Forever.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that again?
Toad, TOAD at Eskimo.com. I like the incongruity of it.
Eskimo, is that Yahoo or is that?
No, look at the chat, Ginny, like in the Zoom chat. It's in the Zoom chat transcript.
Yeah, no, it's not Yahoo or Google or Gmail or any of those. It's its own little server. It runs out of Seattle. And
well, I'm going to send you an email as a test to make sure it works.
Thank you, Ginny.
All right, let's move on because this part of the YouTube stream is going to be really boring. Because
yeah, okay. So let's dive in. So the whole reason that I walked us through the diagrams was partly to answer Sharon's question, but because Sharon's initial question sets us up so well to understand what we're reading in this essay. Right from the opening sentences, we're now getting into these questions of who are the Aristoi, who are the Dualoi, who are the Banausoi that he's talking about, and why does he say the things about them that he does? And how does that relate to mythos and logos? You can start to see it coming together a little bit, right? That there's a really sophisticated system with multiple layers involved, but it's not a Kantian or Platonic style system where he said, I want there to be a system. This is the system I've invented and I'll now hammer everything to make it fit into the system. He's doing the opposite. And he's trying to say, well, what do we actually see when we look at people? And what do we actually see when we look at cultures? And what are the patterns that we get? So his version of a system is just a model. And any place that it's wrong, rather than saying, well, ignore that, he'll say, well, then let's fix the system. We're trying to describe the actual world, not some perfect Smithian system of ideas. Kenneth Smith is an anti-Smithian in that sense. He doesn't want there to be a Smithian system. He wants us to see the actual world. So right from the opening sentence, we are linking back to the previous session on yin and yang, right?
Mm-hmm.
But he's doing it by saying the reason that they come together is because of Heraclitus. Heraclitus was a very yin and yang kind of guy. He's constantly talking about opposites and the relationship of opposites and the interpenetration of opposites. And right here, I have a little footnote I put in. And if we jump to note number 9, it's just this quote from Wheelwright's Heraclitus on the way up and the way down are one and the same. That's what Heraclitus says. The way up and the way down are one and the same. They're traveling the same road. And that road is not just some arbitrary pair of directions, but it's an actual system of relationships between the things that we think are the best and the things we think are the worst. They're part of some dynamic, natural system of forces that we could study and learn about. This is Heraclitus. It's writing 2,500 years ago. And he's talking about the dialectic right off the bat and about the nature of the cosmos. So, but then Kenneth says each of these factors or forces is vastly more complex and involuted constellation of perspectives than moderns can generally comprehend. And now that we've walked through looking at Hegel's model and Kierkegaard's model, Nietzsche's model, right? Kenneth Smith's model, Hannah Arendt's model, we're starting to see that you can look at the same thing from multiple perspectives and see different things emphasized. And it sort of looks different. But at the same time, once you compare them, you can see how they're describing the same things about the world, just from different angles. And it's because the world is so complex that it can bear up all these perspectives. And the more of these that we see, the better we sort of start to understand the nature of the relationship between the faculties we're born with, what our life experience is like when we try one faculty or the other faculty, what happens when we try to design a life for ourselves using one or the other, and how that magnifies into culture. And of course, eventually, how that magnifies into whole epochs of history, where, cultures tended to follow along a similar set of ideas until it was overthrown and they moved on to a new set of ideas. So variations on a theme describes the history of civilizations and cultures around whatever their epoch is built off of. Marianne, go ahead.
So I have this feeling when I was reading, I only got to page 11. So it was talking about Kierkegaard and the German housewife who only took the fireplace thongs.
Yes.
And
I love that
I'm
metaphor so much.
I have been a housewife and I understand her. I
Yes.
understand why she took the thongs or
Yes.
I understand it. And the goddess of the hearth, you know, the Greek goddess of the hearth, the potential and the hope for another fireplace, another
Yes.
place to live is there.
Yes. Yes. It's brilliant. It's potent, right? Sharon, go ahead.
I have a question.
Yeah.
In the last paragraph here, where Kenneth Smith describes the Aristoi,
Yes.
he seemed to have dealt the hardest with them.
Yes.
And Heraclitus ends the paragraph by saying, even though they're the highest evolved in birth, rank, and nobility, they are seekers of gold. And in parentheses, he has wisdom. They dig up much earth and find little.
Yes.
So even though they're the highest evolved, they do not have the maximum insight or the maximum enlightenment. That's the word I'm searching for. So how do you reconcile all of that? In fact, he called them their mercenary artisans or self-besotted prostitutes. I thought that was pretty significant.
So let me unpack these. You know, this is good stuff here. So let's start with the latter. When he compares them to mercenary artisans, what he's actually saying is that most artists are not Aristoi. Right? He says the vast majority of artists are not Aristoi. Instead, what they are is they're mercenary artisans or self-besotted prostitutes. And what he means is they're doing stuff for money, or they're doing stuff to please others, and they're excited about themselves and the work that they're doing, but they're still not actually achieving everything that human beings are capable of achieving. Because as long as your motives for art are strictly to do what makes money, you will set aside things you would have done otherwise that wouldn't make money but might be greater works. You'll select the inferior works that are more profitable. And you have the same problem in the non-mercenary but prostitute version, where he's using the word prostitute not about sex workers, but anybody who lives to please others, right? And I as someone who grew up in an alcoholic family, I was the pleaser. My brother was the rebel whose job was to act out the drama of the family and get us to talk about it. I was the moderator pleaser whose job was to try to smooth over the problems and make everybody not be angry again. And what I didn't know, and what no pleaser knows, is that the service that you're providing is permitting the abuse to continue by preventing it from ever reaching a crisis, de-escalating crises, calming everybody down. So I know all about being a pleaser in the sense that he means it here. So this is how I grew up. And when you're a pleaser, you sacrifice your own needs to focus on the desires of others. It may not even be the needs of others. You're just trying to make them happy. And what makes them happy might be what's worst of all for them. After my mom was diagnosed with the liver disease, that
cirrhosis,
not the infectious one, the incredibly infectious one.
Infectious hepatitis.
Hepatitis. She was diagnosed with hepatitis, and she was told by her doctor she absolutely had to stop drinking. But she was a depressive, and alcohol was her self-medication. So she switched to non-alcoholic beer for a while, but after a while, she started asking her husband and my younger brother to go to the store and get her beer. And they did. Even though they knew it would kill her and they wanted her to live, they wanted her to be happy. And the only thing that would make her happy is the thing that would hurt her. This is what he means here. So an artist who's too focused on what other people want is disconnected from what is the most important or best art that they could possibly do, the most profound art that they could do. They've turned away, either as mercenaries to money or as prostitutes to pleasing people. And they lose sight of the full potential of themselves as an artist. And he's not saying they all are. He's just saying it's the norm in our culture, the way that we structure our world. The norm is there's all these perverse incentives that drive you away from your artistic authenticity. That would distinguish an aristic artist from a non-aristic artist. I'll come back to you in a sec. I see Dave's got his hand up.
I just wanted to give a quick anecdote since we were talking about Herbie Hancock and Miles Davis that ties into this point. You know, Miles was the king of playing ballads, most known for that, probably could have done that for his entire career and did very well, coming to prominence playing slow jazz ballads. He gave up playing ballads, and when people asked him why, he said it was precisely because he enjoyed playing them so much. So this gets into, you know, he saw himself becoming sort of a musical prostitute and could have easily have been whored out for money and done the same thing for the rest of his life.
Yes.
Probably not even no effort to him at all, but to continue to become Aristoi, although he didn't have that language to describe it, he continued to push himself. And that's why we have fusion and some of these other art forms that he invented, essentially.
Yes. Yes. So what he's doing in this second paragraph, where he's talking about Aristoi are the most fascinating and anomalous extreme case of what's possible, he's talking about the fact that in our culture, it's very hard to be an Aristos. And if you are, you're probably a warped one. So our culture is hostile to Aristoi. Banausoi can be controlled and corralled because of their focus on immediacy. You can dangle a carrot in front of them. You can focus on their feelings. You can manipulate them. And it's focused on Banausoi, who are the manipulators and the people who rise up, you know, according to systems, because they'll follow a system. The Banausoi will follow a system. And the system can be used to snare the Dualoi. And as a result, you seem to have a going, sustainable culture. But the problem is that Aristoi are disruptive. They're always trying to dig under our feelings and under our systems to look at what are the deeper truths we didn't know about when we built this system. That if we were true to those deeper principles, we'd have to change a lot of things. And if we change a bunch of things, it's going to interfere with people's profits. And it's going to interfere with their sense of right and wrong and true and false. And that's disruptive. Now, past cultures, before modernism, before medievalism in the ancient world, there were cultures that harnessed Aristoi to be able to revolutionize themselves and change over time. But the predicate of modernism is that those people have to be suppressed. So you use perverse incentives to punish them for heuristic behavior so that they will warp themselves into behaving like Dualoi or Banausoi so that they won't disrupt the system. As a result, he's talking about here, even people who are just full of the potential to become Aristoi typically don't in our culture. They become something else. They bend themselves out of shape. So he says, in my house of nearly 100,000 books, and by the way, if you think he's exaggerating, he's not. I've seen it. His house is a labyrinth.
I saw that.
My house of nearly 100,000 books, I could create a shrine to true and incendiary Aristoi that would consist of half a little wall at most. He says there's hardly any deeply penetrating writers. And one of the ways that you can tell, which we're going to find out in just a second, is when you start digging into Aristic writing, it's astonishing. Like every sentence you're having to stop and go, what? Really? It's so gripping with the things that matter. It's cutting right to the point. We get used to being able to read rapidly over long sections of fluff and gradually putting together the point, or skimming over large sections of filler in order to find the few sentences that matter. But Aristic writers write with such a density you have to slow way down, and their works tend to be shorter because it doesn't take them as long to say things. There's a famous Nietzsche saying, I want to say in 10 sentences what other people say in a book. And then he says, what other people don't say in a book, right? That art of concentration, of trying to boil down the most important parts and just say those was an archaic Greek virtue. And it's something that Aristoi focused on. So when he says seekers after gold, i.e. wisdom, dig up much earth and find little, he's not just trying to, he doesn't say they find nothing. When I first read this line for Heraclitus 20 years ago, I read it as nothing, but that's not what he means. He means you got to be prepared to learn a lot of stuff and read a lot of stuff and expose yourself to a lot of things and sift through it to find the nuggets of wisdom that are buried in all of this dross. In the book Heraclitus by Philip Wheelwright, which is kind of my go-to book for translations of Heraclitus, the aphorism immediately before or after this one says, "Men who love wisdom should acquaint themselves with a great many particulars." And that's how to interpret this line. He's saying you have to learn a lot of stuff to begin to see the deeper patterns. And
there's a bit of the ethos of kind of Sisyphus in this.
Yes.
Yes, he talks about it.
I'm so glad you said Sisyphus. Kenneth Smith loves to talk about this. He says the modern portrayal of Sisyphus is that he was bad and he was sent to hell to be punished. And he was punished by having to roll a rock uphill for all eternity. But that is a modernist perspective. It is a deeply anti-philosophical perspective. So Sisyphus, the name, is derived from sophos, the verb, meaning to taste. Sisyphus is the superlative form of the verb to taste. He who has the most taste, who has the deepest, most exquisite judgment, the most tasteful person. And what you read in Aristotle and Heraclitus and elsewhere is that the Aristos, what distinguishes the Aristos personality-wise from the other types is that the other types are very blunt by comparison, right? A doulos is I like what I like and I don't like what I don't like. And a banausos is I like what my systems of thoughts tell me to like, right? So Dualic architecture would be very comfortable for the doulos, for the amount of work that they put into it. It'd be their perfect home, but nobody else might want to live in it. And it also might not be optimized because they might have decided to stop working on it because, it's too much effort. A banausos will make some building that you look at and you're shocked by the design. You see this design on it. You're like, wow, somebody really thought about that. But when you actually go to live in it, it's awful because it's an idea of a house. It's not a real house. It doesn't have any lived in concrete naturalness to it. It's all full of ideas and systems and wheels. And that what you see with an Aristos is that they have this thing the other two are missing that causes them to miss the target. They have a sense of tastefulness. And so an Aristos can miss the target a lot, but they notice that they missed and they'll come back at it from another angle. And that's why to a banausos, an Aristos seems like they're too fumbling. They're too unsure of themselves. They're too experimental. And they're always talking about, well, this doesn't quite feel right. This isn't quite right. Because the Aristos can taste the miss, that they didn't quite get it. Whereas a banausos is like, well, if it satisfied my algorithm, then it's a hit, regardless of whether anybody wants to live there. I don't care about that. I care about this is what I learned in school about how you design a building. I checked off all the points. It's a perfect building. The fact that it's inhumane is of no interest to me because I'm detached from humanity and reality. I'm living in my abstract world of ideas. You know what I mean? And the banausos could be so thrilled by the materials they made it out of and the cantilevering design and all these little bits and pieces that they've missed the fact that nobody wants to be there. So Sisyphus is the man of the most taste because Sisyphus is an Aristos. Sisyphus is what Oedipus is not. And the reason that Sisyphus is rolling the boulder uphill for all eternity is because that's what it's like to be an Aristos. And Aristos, this is what Phil was talking about, when Sharon was talking about, that to be an Aristos is not to be settled. It's not to say, it's not to say I like who I am and I'm never going to change the way a doulos does. And it's not to say I worked to become somebody different and now that I have, I'm done and I'm at the end of history the way that a banausos does. It's to say, I have to constantly be looking, constantly be evaluating, always putting my ideas to the test because there's always something better out there in the real world that I just haven't found yet. And so I've always got to be rolling the boulder uphill. I have to seek after gold. To seek after gold, I have to dig up a lot of earth. Dig and dig and dig and dig and look and look and look and look and never end. Never stop. Never be complacent. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I think that's good, though.
Oh, yeah. So the Greeks didn't think Sisyphus was in hell, right? He's just a philosopher. That's what it is to be a philosopher. But we read that and we're like, oh, God, well, of course we want things to be easy. If he's having to roll a boulder uphill for all eternity, that sounds hard. Somebody must have condemned him to do this as a punishment. That's what a doulos would think. Doulos think that philosophy is just a whole bunch of hard work for no good reason. And
well, that's what I thought all these years.
Right? And Banausoi think that, Aristoi are just too fuzzy-headed, and they're always messing around with the excluded middle. They're murking about in things that, are neither true nor false, and who cares? I mean, if that's what you want to do for a hobby, fine, but you can't expect anybody else to do it because, I mean, obviously it's just some idiosyncratic, subjective, worthless thing. This is what a Banausoi thinks about philosophy. It's only the Aristos who says the work is the point. I'm trying to move along. I'm trying to learn more and discover and become a better person than I was tomorrow than I was yesterday. Sharon, you had your hand up.
Yeah, the topic of this, and I apologize for all the other philosophers, but I'm not a philosopher, but I read a lot of this. The third part of this is Mythos, Aristos, and Agon, which is conflict, I think. And so on page 62 in my edition, he says, and I want to follow up on what you said about the Banausoi. The Banausoi set the dominant tone of modern culture.
Yes.
They orchestrate its ultimate strategies, including certainty, its suicidal stasis, or Karl Kampfen as well. It is self-conscious and it is in self-conscious and self-reflection that we become most perfectly and utterly stupefied. Now,
Yes.
I found that paradoxical.
Yes. We love a good paradox.
Yes.
So the
It's
Banausoi are
conflict. Yes. Go ahead.
yes. That the Banausoi are really the architects of modernism. Modernism was designed by and for Banausoi. It was designed to please the noetic mindset. It's a very Verstand project to try to make a system of laws, not men, to try to make an economy of money and not of actual value, in which even religion, even the divine, has to be systematized and stuck into some kind of schema of logic, because that's the way that Banausoi see the world. So that's what he means when he says they're orchestrating its ultimate strategies. They're the ones who are defining modernism. So when he says it's self-consciousness and self-reflection that we've become most perfectly and utterly stupefied, that one of the the Kierkegaard line that one of the defining characteristics of a delusion is that it rules out the thought that if you could think it, you would realize you were stuck in a delusion. It seems to exclude parts of reality so that they're unthinkable. And as a result, your belief system starts to look like it's complete because it's hiding all the things that would show that it's incomplete. You know what I mean? There's a foreground background thing that's done by an ideology. And an ideological culture and an anti-culture like modernism does the same thing on a massive scale. So that all the heuristic possibilities of challenging and questioning the deeper truths of why we do the things we do are sort of suppressed and ruled out. And we're replaced instead with sort of pleasing, circular, self-reinforcing anti-myths, like the reasonable person theory, or the social contract is another one. The idea that we decided to be in this culture rationally after evaluating the alternatives, it's completely false. When in my life did I ever sit down and have a conversation with all the other cultures and say, those all sound nice, but I think I'm going to do modernism instead? This never occurred. But by having the anti-myth of a social contract, it makes us feel like we're not prisoners. It makes us feel like we chose it, even though we never chose it. We were raised inside it and inculcated in it. So this is what he means when he talks about being perfectly and utterly stupefied, is that the system is designed to defeat the kinds of questions that would break you out of the system and enable you to look at it objectively. And instead, we end up taking its premises for granted as though they were evidence that it's correct. And we don't even realize that our mind has been bent around in a circle like that. We can't see that it's happening. We're stuck in a little envelope.
That's where we are now.
That's where we are now. Yes. James, go ahead.
Yeah, would you say something about fideism and faith? Did he make a distinction between those two?
Oh, he's hard on faith. Fideism is easier. Fideism is faith sort of devolved into an ideology.
Okay, all right.
So it's when the point of it is the faith that you have in it rather than the thing itself. It's like the difference between authentic worship of Jesus and worship of your own worship of Jesus.
Right.
You know what I mean? There are people who say only the faith matters. And as long as I have the faith, I go to heaven at the end. There's nothing more to see here, which of course means you've erased everything Jesus said. Jesus had a lot to say about how we ought to live in the world and treat each other. But by making the article of faith itself the thing that you worship, you can erase Jesus and then claim to be a follower of Jesus. So it converts the religion into a fideism.
Is that akin to, wait, that's not what Nietzsche meant when God is dead, though, right? Is it? Or I'm not sure.
Oh, yeah. That goes right to the heart
Okay.
of what Nietzsche was talking about, is we erase God and replace him with our own form of reverence of God, as though the forms that we go through were a replacement for God.
Okay.
And he also was trying to get at the same thing Kierkegaard gets at in his very last writings, which is to what extent are the conventions of the church different from the teachings of Jesus? And to the point that you can have things like prosperity gospel, where people are saying, Jesus wants me to be rich. And if I'm rich, that proves that Jesus has chosen me to go to heaven. And in doing that, you're ignoring the eye of the needle, right? I mean, where's the camel in all of this? It's like in a complete inversion of Jesus, and yet they don't see it because the conventions of the church that they are in don't talk about that anymore. They focus on this other piece. You know, if God chose you, then God would bless you, and the blessings would take material form, and therefore you're rich, and therefore rich people are going to heaven, and everybody else is going to hell at the end. You know, it's like there's ways to turn this inside out and subvert it, which have been done to it. So that's part of what he's getting at there. But if we go back to the beginning, so we're going to have to, I think it's going to take multiple weeks to get through this. This is like 10 pages.
I love it.
Densely reasoned stuff. Let's see, where are we here? The opening paragraph is the buried in the heart. The second paragraph is Aristos are the most fascinating. The third one, right after Seekers After Gold. He says, myth is the primal mode of meaning for the intuitive mind, for the gnosic mind, for the Begriff Vernunft mind, not for the Verstand mind. It is the logic or interconnectedness or organic structure of what exists. Now, he's going to build on that, but I actually want to stop right here halfway through the sentence. Because this reference to logic is a reference to logos. Right? He's always, when he's writing, he's always aware of the etymology of the words.
Is this big L logos or small L logos?
Yes. Well, in this case, he says, since it's the interconnectedness or organic structure of what exists, that's physis. So that's big L logos. So this is where he's saying what I showed you in the diagram. It's not a myth unless it is making intuitive and clear to us the nature of the cosmos. If it is doing the opposite, if it is obscuring the cosmos and centering us in, the rational self-interest or the social contract or any of these other, imaginary events or entities, then it can't be a myth because those things aren't real. It's moving us off the track of the cosmos and into the world of our postulated reality, our noetic, worldview. So that's why the reference to what exists is here. And that's why the reference to logic is here. He's not talking about the noesis. He's talking about the gnosis, because gnosis is the mode of thought in which we focus on what exists and what its deeper principles are and how it works. And of course, the whole thing is it's difficult when we're reading it because the words are like quantum superpositions that could mean either one. And if you don't know which one it means, you can read the sentence as the opposite of what he's trying to say. So to this end, I thought I would stop right here and talk about Heraclitus for a while. Because even though, he named Heraclitus the sentence in paragraph before, he didn't say it in this sentence, but Heraclitus is all over this sentence. This thing is a flow. And I can show you the Heraclitus that's hiding in this sentence that I know Kenneth is talking about. because Kenneth's great magnum opus that he never finished, and maybe I can help to get him, maybe David and I can lean on him and get him to finish, was a series of books on Heraclitus. He was going to unpack Heraclitus and show all of the Hegel and Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and Marx and Hannah Arendt and everything else that's buried in Heraclitus by unpacking the aphorisms. So I thought I would unpack a few. I just share with you some aphorisms right here that are built into this sentence subtly, and see if you can see them. If you guys are game.
Yes.
All right. I happen to have them right here in a little note. Each of these, the specific wording of each one of these comes out of the Philip Wheelwright Heraclitus, but other translators do various versions of them. They're all from real fragments. So the first thing he says about this is that most people do not take heed of the things they encounter. This is the sleepwalking metaphor. Nor do they grasp them even when they've learned about them. And he's talking about noesis here. You can learn about a thing and have a model of it and still be completely wrong about what it actually is. It says, although they suppose they do. They think they are dealing with reality, and they're actually dealing with this imaginary version of reality that's in their heads. This is where Hegel got his stuff about Verstand and abstraction and the dangers of noesis. There's other quotes in Heraclitus as well. Heraclitus talks a great deal about, as much as people know about you can't step in the same river twice, Heraclitus writes a great deal more about how people miss the point and have their own ideas and get stuck in their heads. Then he says, and this I've imposed this order. There is no order of the fragments. Nobody knows what the order of the fragments was. So I've just chosen this particular order to go through them in. He says, in order to slamming Verstand and slamming noesis hard, Heraclitus says, human nature has no real understanding. Only the divine nature has it. Now, there's two ways to see this. First of all, he's not saying there's no point in trying to study things. We know that from other fragments where he tells you, dig up a lot of gold. You got to dig up a lot of dirt. If you want to find the gold, you got to dig. He wants you to be learning. But he's saying the problem is we have to understand that the understanding that we have should not be confused for the real thing. It's not the real thing. It's a parallel understanding. It's just a model. It's not the real thing. And furthermore, when he says only the divine nature has it, the crucial thing to know about ancient Greek is that you could flip terms around so that you get two sentences out of the same sentence. You know what I mean? He's in English, order is important to determining grammar, but Greek is a highly inflected language. You know what the subjects and objects are without caring about the order. And that means you can flip the order around in ancient Greek in a number of different ways and still mean the same thing. And conversely, you can flip subject and object and get a whole other meaning out of it. Now, the archaic Greeks used to do that on purpose all the damn time. They loved it because it was a way to get one sentence to say multiple things. It was a way to concentrate meaning. So when he says only the divine nature has it, you could start by reading it as saying, he's saying the gods have real understanding, but people don't. You see that interpretation? Right? Human nature has no real understanding, only the divine nature has it. The gods see things as they are. That's what makes them gods. And human beings don't see them as they are. And that's part of what makes us mortals. If we could see things as they actually are, well, that would mean we would have had to have been a god to pull that off.
So we always have to interpret. We're always interpreting what is there, right? Yeah.
And also that we also always have to have a somewhat skeptical relationship to our own understanding.
Right.
That we have to know it's
Interestingly, seeing things as they are is also how Buddhists describe enlightenment.
Yes. Yeah, as we talked about last week, there is a good chance that there was some intercourse between the Buddhists and the archaic Greeks.
And also, could it be that we are evolving slowly toward godliness? Because there are scientists who are, for example, discovering that plants are sentient beings. There's been some philosophical meetings about that, how a tree, when it knows it's getting ready to die, it will send its nutrients to its own offspring. 50 yards down the line, even though there's another tree 5 feet away from it.
Yes.
The
That
nurse
kind
log.
of behavior, huh?
The
And
nurse
the nurse
log.
log too. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
The scientists are continuing to know more and more about the Mother Nature, for example. So maybe
Yes.
we human beings are slowly evolving toward understanding and really knowing nature.
It's certainly the case that the archaic Greeks did not erect the impassable gulf between the human and the divine that the medieval church did. In the medieval church, God is God and everything else is worthless except that God bestows his grace upon them, which gives them value. God is the only source, and he's infinite, right? He's omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, and we aren't. So therefore, it's impossible for us to ever become gods under the medievalist perspective of the world. But in the archaic Greek perspective of the world, if you read the myths, you'll see that people were becoming gods were dying, or were becoming more mortal. Things were changing into other things. There's this constant flow in the cosmogony of the ancient world, and it implies that it might be possible to cross that gulf. But in order to do it, you would have to transform your nature from a human nature to a divine nature. So part of what Heraclitus is saying here is the divine nature is superior to the human nature, and one of its characteristics is that it can actually understand things the way they are. And that means to the extent to which we can come to understand things closer to the way they are, we become closer to having a divine nature. And that would be good. We ought to be wanting to emulate the divine without ever confusing ourselves with it. We should be, that's why he pushes the boulder up the hill. We should be struggling, working to do better than we are and to move in that particular direction where the sacred and the divine lie. Sharon.
I have a question. I'm not sure about this. Isn't one of the basic tenets of Hinduism in the repeating life cycles that with each life cycle you either devolve or evolve towards the divine nature?
Yes.
And one of the fascinating things that I found about any kind of theology, whether it's Buddhism, Hinduism, Egyptian mythology, is how there is significant overlap.
Yes.
For example, I was visiting Cambodia, and the Holy Trinity is something that I thought was specific to Christianity. Not so.
Surprise.
Not so.
Yes.
Not so. And so then I started wondering, well, which religion predated which? And you found that in terms of the older religion, Christianity is fairly young.
It is. It is. That's right. Yeah, studying the history of religion is always fascinating for helping to put Christianity into context and figure out what actually is it distinct as a distinct movement.
Did Sharon just say that Christianity is younger than Hinduism? And
yes.
Oh, it is. Oh,
yes.
I didn't know that.
Well, Hinduism is one of the oldest religions on earth. It appears to go back to the Stone Age,
Yes.
as far as we can tell, which is amazing.
Oh, what about Buddhism?
Buddhism is older than Christianity, but much younger than Hinduism. It arose out of Hinduism. Buddha himself was raised as a Hindu originally.
Mm-hmm. So this feeds into the sentence where he says, only the divine nature has it.
Yes.
Is he speaking as a Christian?
No, this is Heraclitus.
Yeah, but is he speaking as a Christian then? Because in Christianity, you're not supposed to be divine. Only God is.
Exactly. This is a counter-Christian idea that he's got. It's and some of what makes it non-Christian only becomes apparent when you realize that if you move the words around, he's not just saying that the gods have real understanding because they're divine. He's also saying nature is divine. And he's saying that because in the Greek worldview, the gods are part of nature. Right? So if part of nature is sacred, then the sum totality of nature, which is greater than that, must also be sacred. You can see the ancient epoch's definition of nature and then the divine and then the human as the structure of reality and the nature and priorities and sources of meaning is hiding even in this sentence. just like you'll see it everywhere else too. Once you're looking for it, it's all over the place. And Greece just took it for granted. Aristotle drops references to nature all over the place throughout his writings, nature or natural. And we assume he just means it in a modern sense, that that's just the way things are. But every time he's referencing it, he's referencing the sacred, because the ancient Greeks believed that nature encompassed the divine as well as the human. Mm-hmm. So there's all this stuff packed in here as assumptions for the worldview for us to see. Marianne, you got your hand up.
Yes. So in my personal philosophy that I've developed, which I'm beginning to think may be erroneous, is I always thought feelings would save the world if we really cared and had compassion for each other. And now I'm thinking it's only split, like it's not the logic and the feelings are somehow reigns on Atma's vehicle, the charioteer.
Right. Right. I mean, the ancient Greek perspective, if they were to see what we see today, would be that, we would get into certain kinds of troubles if we were driven only by our feelings, but we get into other kinds of troubles if we avoid our feelings and are driven only by our ideas. And that it is only by drawing on the strengths of both of them and putting them together in service to humanity that we're going to save ourselves. So, they would say, you're on the right track, because what defines modernism is that we've moved too far away from our feelings, too far away from empathy. We've said, well, the law has to be blind. And even if it's unfair, even if it's cruel, it has to work out according to its mechanisms and do the things that it does without regard for what would actually be good or bad. And that's wrong. I mean, you just know that that's wrong. You got to pay attention to the actual circumstances that people are in. And the law ought to be tasteful in how it's applied. It ought to fit well with the actual ethics and needs of the situation. And to do that, we'd have to move more in the direction of feelings than we are right now. Richard and then Sharon.
And so I think this is a good way to segue back to my request at the beginning, which we don't have much time for, but I mean, I think, well, I think this won't be the only time we'll see something we'll need to respond to in the world around us.
Yeah.
Which is getting back to, the events of last week. So I want to quote, and I'll provide a link in the chat. This is a recent discussion interview between writer activist Chris Hedges and Dr. Cornel West, responding to the events of last Wednesday. It's unfortunate that it's on RT America, Russia Today America, but that's where Chris, that's one of the media outlets that Chris has, and Chris as a critic, as an maybe in this phrasing as an Aristoi, is basically pushed to the margins, of our society and corporate media. So Chris starts out kind of quoting and summarizing Emil Durkheim, which and the concept of anomie, which I think also also ties into Nietzsche's Amythia, and then our our study of Mythos. So Emil Durkheim writes about suicide that when social bonds are ruptured, societies and individuals carry out acts of annihilation. So this is the anomie, specifically anomic suicide that Emil Durkheim is studying. There's other forms of suicide. He's for example, there's altruistic suicide, but that's a side tangent. But one of the fascinating points so this Durkheim makes in the book is that those that seek the annihilation of others are driven by desires of self-annihilation. And then they go to speak kind of the disorientation, and the despair, of those in this state. And so this is now, I'm quoting and summarizing Cornel West. So Cornel West, so Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Chekhov understood the ways in which people must have a sense of connecting their self-respect with a community, with the tradition, and with a heritage in the face of markets. And summarizing, in the face of these forces of an alienation in our modern world and our culture, or as how Kenneth Smith would put as an anti-culture. And then he continues to say, there has to be some kind of enabling cultural matrix, some structures of meaning and feeling that allows to get people to make their move from wombs to tombs. And he emphasizes and he pauses on that word feeling. And so I wanted to kind of, yeah, I'll put a link to it. It's a really
That's
good
beautiful.
interview.
That reinforces what Marianne was just saying. Yeah.
So can I just add something to what Marianne is saying? And in my evolution, I believe that it takes both sides of the equation, the thinking and the logical part of it. And I've coined a term, and I read a book on this. It's called the power of constructive thinking. And when you look at societies, constructive thinking in any society have got to support what I call the common good. And in my own mind, I am trying to decide what that means. Right. And that's where I am. It's not too much thinking. It's not too much logic and drawing of the hard line. It's got to be somewhere in the middle, but it's got to be constructive. And that's, I mean, I don't ascribe that to any philosopher. It's just my own survival mode right now.
Hegel says we have to pull these components together and make a whole out of our mind, because we need the strengths of both of them. And that's what you're saying, that you've got to pull from both sides in order to create a whole way of looking at the world that makes sense. I just wanted to give a couple of examples. You know, I know we're running short on time, but Richard, you asked about current events and, you know, how would all of this apply to it? And one of the things is that because of my background working with the Department of Veterans Affairs, I have a variety of people that I know very well and have known for decades from different kinds of politics, who, you know, they've helped us to build the same. Most people's experience with Trump followers is that they're those other guys over there who are, you know, being awful. But I've got people who are Trump followers who have also dedicated their lives to medical software, and, you know, God knows how many lives they've saved by improving the software to detect medical conditions and help people get treated earlier. So these people present a conundrum for me. I can't just wall them off the way a lot of people do, because I see the good and the bad in them at the same time, both equally strong. So I've been in some conversations with some of them since Wednesday. And one of the key things that helps us to understand them in the context that we've just been speaking about for the last 3 hours is that they are relating to a different world than the one we're living in, right? In their world, the election was stolen, and they can prove it. They know it. They've got the evidence that they need. They don't realize the evidence has been cherry-picked, right? They're thinking noetically. So they're inhabiting a system of thought in which they have all the evidence they need to prove that the ideas are true, and they're drawing logical conclusions about what they should do from those premises. And the problem is, as we said before, if you've got the wrong premises, it doesn't matter how clear your thinking is. You could be the smartest person in the world, but if you think noetically from those premises, you could conclude that there is an ongoing coup and that you have to rush the Capitol and stop the vote, that that's the only way to save humanity. It's like we tend to dismiss it as an emotionalist, angry, bigoted reaction, but it can also be a calmly arrived at reaction. It can make all the sense of it. Can be valid logical thinking and still be 100% false. The thing that I like to compare it to is the Inquisition, right? Mm-hmm. In which they tortured people to death. You can't think of a less Christian thing to do, the less Jesus thing to do, to torture people to death. But if you thought that this life is finite and the afterlife is infinite, and that what was at stake was whether people were going to be tortured for all eternity or rewarded for all eternity, then the stakes are so high that it would be an easy choice to make to give people some temporary pain if it would help to save them from an eternity of torture. If it could get them if it could save their immortal souls from hell, torturing their body seems like a small price to pay in order to help them to convert and be saved for all eternity. So there is a logic to the torture. And it's not just a possible logic. If you have bought the premises, it is the only logical conclusion to make. It's a profound and compelling logic. And so you can see how noesis can lead you to do things that are deeply out of touch with reality and that we might think of as deeply unethical and criminal. But if you accepted all the premises, you would think it was the height of virtue. What could be better? What could be better than that? I'll call you a sec share, and Richard's got his hand up first.
Yeah, no, I agree. And like, I think, like we understand more now, like, confirmation bias, like, and like, we can be opposed to what they're doing, but at the same time, there are times we realize we can be guilty of that too. And we have to try to catch ourselves and question ourselves. Right. And like, yeah, they are thinking about it very logically through, and cherry picking, and it's something out of something deep emotionally, and they may not even be fully aware of it. Right. And I'm really also dismayed by, like, say, the mainstream establishment, like CNN and the Democratic establishment, in that they also have very poor emotional intelligence in just kind of pointing out these facts and talking down to them in this really condescending way, and not realizing that they're approaching, trying to talk, they're not reaching out to the other side with emotional intelligence, and they're not understanding how to get to that root as well. A friend of mine recently shared a really good podcast. This is from a particular episode, On Being with Krista Tippett. I don't know if anyone's heard of her. And she's interviewing Arlie Hochschild, who is known as a sociologist of emotion. And she spent 5 years like getting to know, like she's from Berkeley, but she spent 5 years basically getting to know people like that, like in the heart, like Red America, right? And she wrote a book, Strangers in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right, and like I think that can like people on both sides are kind of realize, like, they're from these different realities, like, and they don't recognize what's going on, right? Like both like, the people that stormed the Capitol don't recognize this country anymore, and people who are reacting to that don't recognize this country anymore, and they're both kind of like pointing at each other and delegitimizing each other and saying, this is un-American, right? And it's yeah, not helpful.
Yeah, On Being is a wonderful show. I don't know if it's so in other parts of the world, but in Texas, for example, Sunday morning at 6 to 7 a.m. But she has great, wonderful guests on every week. Yeah.
Thank you, Ginny.
So while I'm here, Rick, real quick, I sent you a test email just now, half an hour ago, and it didn't go into my sent box. So I'm wondering if I wrote it down correctly. Did you say Toad, TOAD at Eskimo, ESKIMO.com, right?
That's the one.
Huh. I wonder why I didn't go through.
Well, I don't know, but that's me. Give it another shot. Sharon's got her hand up next, then Dave and Phil.
Well, I just have, and I want to air my views on this.
Yes.
I hear what you said, Rick, that they perform a task which is beneficial to human beings, right? And because they are good in that sense, it's difficult to see how they could have another side, right? And you said they believe the premise that, the election was stolen. Well, then, so I go above that, the establishment of the premise. And I think in my early book of reading the first one of the book clubs here, I think it's The History of Philosophy by William Durant. That's one of the things, in reading Plato, and this was my first exposure to it, he talked about leaders like that.
Yes.
Right? And we talked about the Aristos, the Banusoi, and the Dualic. But what they all have in common is the desire to be led and to be dictated to. And when you have a leader who establishes that premise, then your emotion kicks in and you believe it.
Yes.
And you cannot see through it. Now, because of my profession, I'm a physician, an anesthesiologist, there is no emotional there. It is evidence. You have to believe in the evidence. You do not have that luxury. And that's my personality. I deal with reality as it is, and not that I wish it to be, because if I wish it to be another way, your life will not be yours when I'm done with it.
Yeah, you kill a patient. That's how you kill patients.
It is what's happening to you right then and there.
That's right.
And so I tend to be very, very evidence-based. Yes, I am emotional, but I hear Phil talk about artists and surrealism, and I don't have difficulty relating to it. I can see it, but like right now, I'm trying to be a photographer, a fine art photography, and the creativity is really a challenge for me because I can't see it.
Yes.
Because what I see is finite.
One way to think about it, Sharon, is think about the revolutions that happen in medicine when new technology allows you to see new information about the patient, and that can alter the modalities of treatment.
Absolutely.
And if you compare the after to the before, that's when you can see the limitations of the previous mindset, in which we treated what we thought the patient was because we didn't have access to the additional information that would have told us, oh, it's actually a lymphoma. But now that we've got the new scanning techniques, we can see the evidence of the lymphoma, and then we treat them differently than we would have before.
But it's not an emotive mindset. It's a technical mindset. Like when I started to give anesthesia, we didn't have the pulse oximeter, the things that we used to diagnose the COVID now. And so when I started as a resident, we didn't have that. And so when we got that, the morbidity statistics across the country changed significantly.
Yes.
But that's evidence-based. That's hard. There's no emotion there. Yes, we're sorry that the technology we had provided a limitation to your management, but now we are better. And so the question I ask myself, is that emotional or is that factual?
But Sharon, consider all...
Well, the factual information that you have, Sharon, makes you emotionally happy or more satisfied with the work that you're doing, I would think, right?
So, absolutely.
Yeah.
But it also
Sharon,
spills out...
where do you practice anesthesiology?
Oh, I live in Florida.
Oh, Florida,
and
because
after 45 years, I'm retired.
Yeah, well, my brother-in-law is an anesthesiologist, and he makes comments like what you just did. You know, I'm a scientist. I'm evidence-based. You know, so it's really interesting to hear you talk.
Just consider.
And I'm an artist. I'm an actress actually, and I was with him a couple of weeks ago, and I needed to get an audition tape together, and I don't want to go and hire somebody to do it for me by going to somebody else's house and everything. So I asked him, I said, would you do the taping for me and help me put this audition tape together? And he did. And he was smiling as he said, oh, I'm going to be a cinematographer and a director today. You know, this is a man who doesn't think creative. He doesn't think himself as a creative person. You know? And wouldn't you know it, he helped me put this tape together. It worked, and I have the gig, and the film is supposed to start shooting in February. So I said, Rick, you know, his name is also Rick, by the way. I have a couple of Ricks in my family. And I said, oh, your first gig as a cinematographer and director worked. I got the job, you know. So it was kind of a joke, but he was pleased by what he did.
Well, we're just extremely left-brained because the task demands it. And it's that left-brainedness that I bring into the real life. The election was stolen? No, it was not. These are what the numbers are.
But wait, Sharon, what about all of the medical diagnosis that were evidence-based, that were based on incorrect evidence, you know, such as SSRIs, or even the theory of why general anesthesia works is not properly understood by scientists.
Or I think,
couldn't you have some compassion for people who believe they are evidence-based, but are, you know, they're being manipulated by the hyper-logos culture, the same
That's what I said.
Hyper-logos culture that could also manipulate people like you who consider themselves to be evidence-based, but perhaps there's a conflict of interest somewhere along the line with a pharmaceutical company, or
further up the line.
It's just something to consider when you you know, are evaluating the other, I'll say, because
or Sharon, like, I think this is maybe closer to your former, you know, professional field. Like, and I think like Law and Order has some great episodes on this, like, you know, where you see the conflict of interest and like the non-evidence based judgment of, say, like, you know, where double blind protocol is violated, you know, for like, you know, like medical trials, like pharmaceutical trials. You know, why do pharmaceutical companies hire these young, very attractive, you know, young women to go to be like, you know, representatives for their drugs, you know, to you know, schmooze and, you know, wine and dine doctors, right? To you know, promote their medications, right?
Well taken, but those are all ethical considerations. But when it comes to you having an illness and you showing up and I am interacting with you one-on-one, providing my diagnosis is correct and I'm treating you appropriately, all that stuff, which is, again, we're back to religion, and, you know, there's the theology and then there's the practice of it. There's the medicine, and then there are all the entrapments which afford us this practice. Those are two different entities, two completely different entities. And I do have compassion for the other. It's not that you don't exist without compassion, because you're human. And I think, Richard, you brought up last week empathy, sympathy, and compassion.
Mm-hmm.
And I told you that I operated among those three at varying levels throughout my entire career. I still practice now, but I retrained and became a family doctor. And that's a whole other, I see the virus with all the social constructs of medicine. And it's very distressing.
But aren't
it's
you guilty?
Well, before I'm gonna interrupt here because Phil's had his hand up for quite a while.
Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, this relates back to something that I wanted to say all the way back to Sisyphus. And I want to bring up another controversial word, right?
Please.
Because language is sort of like very slippery. And
yes,
it is.
Poets understand that. The slippery word I'm bringing up is revisionism. Okay? Now, generally speaking, we think of that as kind of a negative, like, okay, like, yeah, you're just trying to revise the things in relationship to how it used to be. You're bringing progress back to what it could be, and you're trying to revise it. But there's also a forward-looking aspect of it, because if you understand there's new information, you can either go backwards or forwards. You understand that the new information by its very nature is developing and is imperfect, and it needs to be revised.
Correct.
Revisionism, in that sense, is also remaining open to new possibilities rather than closing it down to what it was. Okay,
that's right. That's
a good example of that was, you know, like Zhou Enlai was slammed because he was often called by the other people, the Maoists, as revisionists, right? But in fact, Zhou Enlai is the person who actually saved China from a catastrophe, right? By being able to slippery hang around and equivocate and whatever, and then eventually win over the Maoist idea and revive. Now, we still don't like China, but nonetheless, it's better than it could have been, okay? Because China, as it was, is essentially going to be a very dictatorial system. You know, that's not to say it isn't now. So in that sense, his kind of revisionism was, in a sense, in one sense, trying to save China, but in another sense, to save it in the sense that it could move forward, because at that time it was stuck into this cultural revolution and all that. So that word, which by its very use is has a connotation of being very negative, but you also have to understand the opposite meaning of it.
It's got positive in there too.
Can I just say that revisionism, and Rick, you can expound on this. Revision in the historical sense is part of an operational myth. Take the way America looks at slavery. That history has been revised many, many, many times. I'm from the Caribbean, and we learned about slavery. In fact, just today, I was sitting down talking to one of my friends, said, we're a colonial country, and I didn't grow up seeing any statues of the colonialists. They were all gone. We had statues of our national heroes who were Black.
Yes.
And I'm
As it should
68
be.
years old. And I'm
Yes.
68 years old.
Yes.
Now, so revisionism, historical revisionism, is very different than scientific revisionism, right? It's the same word, but it has different implications.
Yes. Yes. This goes to what Phil's saying. Is it's like we ask a question every time we use a word like this that's polymodal. We have to figure out which mode we mean it in. And how are we applying it here? Or is it a case where it actually is simultaneously more than one mode, in which maybe something both has good and bad hitting you at the same time? It's tricky. And the temptation is to take these words for granted with the definitions that we have in mind at the moment.
I like that word, Phil.
Yeah.
Well, we do have a tendency of being reductionist. I mean, in a sense, reduce it to one state of being rather than
another word, reductionist.
Yes.
And in some sense, poetry, that's why it's kind of like captures much more of a nature. But poetry in today's culture is certainly not worship or whatever, admire as much as it used to be, right?
That's right.
In the 19th century, it was really a very basis of a lot of things, right?
Which is ironic because we need it so badly.
Yep.
We need it so badly, especially now.
Yes.
Go ahead,
One
Sharon.
last comment. I want to make this. And Rick, you talked about, for them, it's reality.
Yes.
Because the premise is established. When I was a young physician, I walked into the holding area in the operating room, and I met my patient. We were about to give her anesthesia. And I said to the nurse, what smells like that? And, I kept on asking her, and she kind of ignored me. Well, when I finally got down to it, the surgery we were going to do, there was this 75-year-old woman. And what she had on her chest was a huge fungating cancer of her breast.
Ah, wow.
Which she had had there for 5 years, right? She did not see it.
Right. In
She
her reality,
did not
it wasn't there.
Own it.
Yes.
And the only reason she had entered into us is because she now had spread and she couldn't walk and take a bath anymore.
Right.
So that's that same mindset. Right? There was the evidence which she ignored. And so I guess I'm asking to get another perspective. And I wouldn't describe myself as concrete, but I look at the facts, and that's been my whole life. And if the oxygen level is dropping, I can't wish that it was staying up. It's dropping. Action is required.
Yeah.
Where are your blind spots, I wonder, right?
Where are my blind spots?
Because you said she couldn't see it. Is there something in your own perspective that perhaps you can't see? That you see what I mean? That would help sort of build a bridge between you and some of these forces that are so inimical to your well-being. It just seems that perhaps if you accepted that your own perspective might not be 100% complete, then you can be more tolerant of people who maybe it's obvious their perspective is not as complete. You see what I mean?
Oh, there is no tolerance means judgment. I don't judge. I just accept. If that's the way you are, then that's the way you are. And I accepted her. This was her manifestation of the life she was going to live. And it was my duty to take care of her.
For when you talked about the Trump supporters, like, for example, the man you were dating when you found out.
Oh, no, he had to get out of my horizon. I can't deal with that. But if I met you.
I don't blame you for that at all, but I just wonder if, I think the point of what Ken Smith is trying to do here is bring us closer together into a unity which is more complete. And so,
well, I must answer that, Dave. Dave, if you look over here, you see a little black woman. So if you are a Trump supporter and Donald Trump is a racist, and people like me are inferior, and relationships involve vulnerability, that is a non-starter.
I totally understand that, but I mean, do you think every Donald Trump supporter is by definition a racist? Is that what you think?
No,
supporters may be
and
a
that's
black
my
woman.
exploration, and that's my exploration.
Okay.
That's
So-
my exploration.
Like, I would just say, be careful of stereotyping other people maybe as fully as, perhaps you've been stereotyped, right? I think the goal is to eliminate maybe all stereotypes or.
Well, and part of it's to figure out when people are engaging in stereotypical behavior themselves without realizing it. So people can be racist without knowing they're racist. Some of these people that I'm talking about that I interact with, they are certain that they're not racist because they have black friends and blah, blah, blah. They can't see the way in which they're supporting a system that's racist. All they see is they don't personally do anything that they identify as bigoted. And so as a result, they think that they're not racist, even though the racist system they're perpetuating couldn't continue without their assistance. So there's a blind spot to them. And it partially comes because of their conception of what racism is or isn't. They think it's like a personal liability and nothing more. They can't conceive of a larger racism that could be, for example,
Probably in the same way that many Democrats think that they're not racist, but could
exactly
be
like
totally
that.
Racist. Yeah,
exactly like that. It's like the desire to simplify things down to the level at which we can self-define ourselves as virtuous cuts across all lines. Everybody wants the comfortable definitions that make it easy. And the more that, racist theory starts to look into the ways that there's environmental racism, there's racism about opportunities, there's racism in how heart attacks are diagnosed because they manifest differently in black men than they do in white men frequently at different ages for different reasons. And these things lead to treatment modalities that reduce the survivability for black men who have heart attacks compared to white men who have heart attacks. But the doctor himself might say, I love black people. I have lots of black friends. I never intentionally did anything that was racist. And therefore he thinks that exempts him from racism, even though yes, a greater number of his patients who were black men, in fact, died from their heart attacks. He just didn't do it on purpose. And so he thinks he's exempt because of how he's defined it. So yeah, there's all this stuff to investigate.
Can I just get in another one, Dave?
Sure. And then Marianne after Sharon.
Sorry, Dave. Racism, I started learning racism at 25 years old when I immigrated to America.
Yeah.
Before that, I never met it. I grew up in Jamaica. I was bright. I was smart. I was the creme de la creme. Mm-hmm. Right? Nobody ever told me. I never saw myself in terms of color, even though my father warned me before I immigrated. Yeah. And when I was immigrating to the South, he said, no, daughter, that's not such a good idea. But I came anyway because it was warm and it was close to home.
Yes.
Right? So racism is a funny thing. There are people, and I think this is an important point to make. I do not know if there are Democrats who think that they're not racist. But what I do know is that they are not willing to implement racist acts. And so I cannot state for your state of mind, right? What I look at is your implementation and how you treat the other.
Right.
I cannot say you're not racist. And I think this is a culture, the myth that people who have a different skin color than I do see you as different. And I was raised in a culture where the motto was out of many, one people. We're all together. And the structure, the society was very class divided. And it was based on money and class. And so all societies have myths. They all do. So I am not saying that because you don't have racist behavior, you're not racist. Or because you have racist behavior, your heart is racist. The two of them work. It's the proof of the pudding is always in the eating. And the proof of the pudding is on that one-on-one interaction.
Thank you, Sharon. Marianne. Oh, wait. Marianne, then Phil, then Richard.
So when we were talking, I was thinking about the Voting Rights Act and John Roberts saying that racism was over in America And I was trying to conceive that in my head. And I think because he was surrounded by white elitism, he thought racism was over. And I think that
Correct.
there is a relationship with context. If you
Yes.
are close to people and anyway, so you got it.
Yeah, you're right on the money. Phil?
Yeah, the problem has to do with the other. It's not just white and black. And you could say that one of the problems you might propose is that if these people would just sort of assimilate and adapt to a way of life,
The
then
melting
everything is
pot.
fine. There's a good example where that's not true.
Right.
And that's the Cherokee Indians.
Right.
They lived in the Carolinas,
Oklahoma.
yeah, and so they had like very good farmland, and they adapted to every way to be like white Americans, right?
Yes.
And to the degree, and I was surprised by this, and don't judge this part, I was surprised by this, to the degree that they actually owned slaves. I mean, that's how far they went. But when Andrew Jackson, which I at one time thought was a hero, when I heard this, I realized, and even the Supreme Court, he was going to move them to Oklahoma, whatever, okay? And when the Cherokee sued and went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, like, that's illegal because we have a treaty with these people, right?
Right.
And Andrew Jackson actually said, that's what the Supreme Court said, let them enforce it.
Right.
I'm moving them to Oklahoma.
Right.
And that's the story of the Trail of Tears. And these people wanted to assimilate. So the mere fact that you want to assimilate and become like whites, that doesn't matter.
Doesn't protect you.
You were still the other, right?
Well, that's exactly my point.
Yeah. Yeah. That you got to look at the behavior.
Yeah, that's exactly my point. And so right now, I think our culture is at a very, very significant juncture, because I believe this underbelly was always there.
Agreed.
It just got ripped off. And for my medical analogy is, you have a wound on your foot that's pussy, and you keep putting a Band-Aid over it. You don't take it in and debride it.
Yes.
And it continues to leak pus. And Donald Trump came and he ripped off that Band-Aid and squeezed out the pus. And here we
Couldn't
are.
pretend anymore.
And here we are.
Yes. I'm going to
Why
call
are
on
you
Richard.
laughing, Marianne?
She's agreeing, I think. Yeah. So I'm going to call on Richard and then Joseph. But I do first want to say it was striking in the early years of this administration how many people's main complaint was they wish his Twitter would be taken away. Because as long as they couldn't see the racism, they were fine with it. But as soon as it became open and they had to personally be embarrassed as a country, that they thought was not okay. Right? Having a disproportionate number of black people in jail, they were fine with that. It didn't affect them. But having someone openly spewing racist stuff, that affected them as white people. And so they were embarrassed. And the thing that the change they wanted to see was, could we cover it up again? Could we just, it was better when nobody could see it. They wanted the Band-Aid, not the cure, right?
That's right. With the pus, the Band-Aid covering the pus.
Richard's turn.
That's a very good segue, because I wanted to quote from Martin Luther King's speech, "The Other America," which he gave in 1967 at Stanford.
Love it.
And so what you just said, having to actually face, the racism openly. So he says here, some of the people who came quickly to march with us in Selma and Birmingham weren't active around Chicago. And I came to see that so many people who supported morally and even financially what we were doing in Birmingham and Selma were really outraged against the extremist behavior of Bull Connor and Jim Clark towards Negroes, rather than believing in genuine equality for Negroes.
Right.
And this is what we've got to see now. And this is what makes the struggle much more difficult.
Right.
So that's what I'm talking about, the behavior and I guess the morality of it.
Yes.
And then he has a really profound statement here. I think also because he's giving this to a bunch of universities, at the university. He says, okay, so he first talks about where racism starts in Germany and then where it leads to, and this is This is the tragedy of racism because its ultimate logic is genocide. If one says that I am not good enough to live next door to him, if one says that I am not good enough to eat at a lunch counter or to have a good, decent job or to go to school with him merely because of my race, he is saying consciously or unconsciously that I do not deserve to exist. To use a philosophical analogy here, racism is not based on some empirical generalization. It is based rather on an ontological affirmation. It is not the assertion that a certain people are behind culturally or otherwise because of environmental conditions. It is the affirmation that the very being of a people is inferior. And this is the great tragedy of it.
Yeah, it is a social construct.
Joseph, then Phil, then Dave.
I'll just say really quick. That's okay. I'll just say really quickly. One of the reasons we don't understand racism, and was actually just alluded to, the idea that we had empirically, and like we say, okay, if this group is doing it this well economically or things like that, then the system isn't racist, and it's much more deeper. It's much deeper than that. People that I think often they don't understand what it is to be different. That's the fundamental problem with racism that I've seen, is that they don't know what the experience is to be different. And until you go into a room where you're the only white person, or you're the only male, or things like that, I think that that's a healthy exercise for everyone, just at least to understand. It's an eye-opener. It's like, that's what you really need to go through, because then you start to understand what it is to be different, and the social constructs of it that exist, you start to understand those as well. But until you really understand by experience of, hey, I'm the only one in this room and I'm different, then it gets really hard. And then we look at things empirically and say, well, we're not racist for this other reason, because of, and that is a misnomer. It is like, oh, okay, we've achieved our quotas, our economic quotas. That's not what it's like. Racism is different. It's that's the hardest part. It's constant too. It's a way of life. It's an experience, and people forget that.
Thank you, Joseph. Phil, then Dave, then Richard.
Yeah, one of the possible objections is that, in a way, is that, well, they're asking for too much. We can't give reparations. I mean, like, they're asking.
They say that a lot.
Exactly. But you remember Al Sharpton's eulogy to George Floyd? He says, we don't want any more than the fact that just get your knees off our necks.
Yes.
So that we could become what we can be. That's it. I mean, like, that's right. That's a reasonable ask, right? It's not like we want all this stuff. You can't give it to us now. No, just get your knee off our neck and let us become what we can be. That's it.
Yeah. It's kind of shocking. I mean, on the one hand, I'm completely pro reparations because, oh my God, white people benefited so much from the economic advantages of slavery. On the other hand, even if all we did was get our knee off their neck, it would be so much better than things are today. Be a massive step in the right direction. It's like, I'd like to see both of these things happen in quick succession. Dave, go ahead.
I wonder if the entire conversation has been colonized by our hyper-logos culture.
Yes.
I mean, we're really coming at this from various angles. And, I'm surprised to hear people having to assert that, like, racism exists. I just thought, of course, everyone knows racism. I mean, it's the history of America. It shouldn't be a surprise. But I feel as though, the media, we can see it when the other side does it, when their media portrays things in a certain way to elicit a certain reaction so that it can consolidate its power and continue to serve the masters of capital. But somehow it's very difficult for us to see it when our side does the same thing. And I just wonder if, did you know that the mere act of identifying your sex and race on standardized tests actually affects people's scores.
Yes.
So that's to say that, you know, if you took people who, so when we constantly hit this nail over and over and over again, does it serve the interests of the people who have been disintermediated over the ages? I would argue it only reinforces their prison. It makes it seem as though it's insurmountable, as opposed to just sort of progressing past it. And I know how you do that is, you know, we could have a million discussions on how to do that, but I just think there's two things here we might want to just pay attention to. Is if the media narratives that we're indulging in are as you know, obviously it's couched in the hyperlogos culture. That's what controls everything. And we can see it when we don't agree with someone's media narrative, but we fail to see it sometimes with the media narratives that we are digesting. I just wonder if it's being pushed so hard to sort of reinforce this divide and conquer, which politicians have used for centuries. And, you know, I'd be curious to hear your perspective, Sharon, because you and I.
Well, you hit a very, 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 very interesting point. And Kenneth Smith talks about it in the article. And when I was reading the book on Will Durant, it is something that I believe with all my heart. The media narrative feeds to a certain group of people. The problem is feeds to the population in general, and we get in our little cubby holes, descend on the side that we want to hear. The big problem is our total lack of capacity to be objective because we're not educated. And I think this is the thing that I think Plato talked about when he was, and I read this in Will Durant's book. So Rick, you helped me on this when he was talking about aristocracy, democracy, and oligarchy. And he said democracy is a great idea if you could keep it. But the thing with democracy is, one, the people doing the choosing have no idea what kind of choice they should make. And that's where we are. And Kenneth Smith talks about education and academia. And I notice he poo-poos it because he doesn't think we learn the skills to even enhance our own enlightenment, much less make a good, informed political choice. And so that comes right back to where you are, right back to what you were saying. And so the media plays into our ignorance, for want of a better word.
Yes. And our divisions.
Yes.
It does. Yeah. Just like you're saying, it's like separates us into interest groups and then gives us the version of the story that satisfies our interest group instead of trying to figure out what's actually going on and helping us to confront it.
And let's remember that these people supposedly organized using Twitter and Facebook and all this stuff, which they have openly said their business model is to divide people and put them into echo chambers so that they can continue to get the dopamine reinforcement that makes the product addictive.
It's maximizing user engagement.
Exactly. And so
well, here's the thing, and I don't mean to cut you off, babe.
Well, I just wanted to say quickly, I guess I wish, Sharon, that you told me you heard that the person you were dating was a Trump supporter. You didn't end the date right there. You stayed in touch with him. You knew that he wasn't going to be a romantic partner for you because you have ideological differences, but that it didn't totally prevent you from getting to know him as a person, because maybe you could have won him over, or he opened his door a little bit to something else. That's sort of where I was going with this.
Well, let me tell you, I'll answer that directly. At 68 years old, it's not a matter of where you're going. It's a question of where you've been, right? And how have you integrated those life experiences to make you a complete human being? That's my modus operandi.
Yeah.
So if where have you been is not where I've been, and near the twain shall meet, then I am not into construction anymore, because we have to die.
Yeah.
I hear
and
you.
and if you and there's a song that I like, we only have 100 years to live by fighting fire. It says 6 to 7 is gone, the sun is high in the sky, and I'm moving on.
I hear
Right.
you.
And so that's
guess,
where I am.
and
That's where I am.
when it comes to romantic life, that's totally understood. I guess I just, I like when people have different opinions than I do, because it gives me an opportunity to learn something from them. Even if I don't agree with anything they say, I can still learn something, and maybe they can learn something more from me. And I feel like we need more of that in our culture, and less just, we need to come together. And
I want to answer that, because I can tell you where I get to execute that. In my retraining, I now volunteer for the Free Clinics of America. And the Free Clinics of America, I deliver primary care to the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. Right. And you said you worked at the VA, so you understand very well what I'm talking about. And I've been in these clinics for about 2.5, 3 years now, and their numbers have exploded. It used to be nice. I could see 4 or 6 patients in 4 hours. I now see 18 patients, and I'm still there 6 hours later, because of the pandemic and because the need is so great. And you get to see there, Dave, the social determinants of healthcare operating. I give you a pretty example, and I teach medical students that rotate through the clinics. And last week, I had a group of white guys, and I told them, today you will never forget this lesson. I had a young Black woman in front of me. She was 35 years old. She was on dialysis because she had a congenital disease of her kidney, polycystic kidneys, which was missed because she's been having kids since she's been 20 years old. She had 4 kids and nobody picked up on it. Why? She was poor and she was Black.
But I think, isn't poor the real determinant there?
Well, I gotta interrupt here, because Richard's been waiting for about 5 minutes with his hand up, so I want to give him a chance. And also, I don't know if anyone's noticed, we're 42 minutes over our 3-hour mark. So as good as this conversation is, we got to save some of it for next time. But before we wrap up, I want to give Richard a shot. So go ahead, man.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of circle back to where I was quoting MLK. And first, I kind of wanted to say not all 74 million people who voted for Trump are racists. I'm not I think we just need to just make sure we kind of frame that. But just sort of as an exercise in empathy, in trying to see, from a viewpoint that you may not, that may seem very foreign, to see through their perspective, but not necessarily agree with it, but at least to see it. So I want to quote, from Lyndon B. Johnson. If you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down on, and he'll empty his pockets for you.
Yes.
And so going back to the ontological affirmation that a race and the very being of them is inferior, it follows very naturally that, the narrative, in our media and our culture and our history is that, the very being of being white is superior, and then white is very much, associated with purity and innocence and goodness, and I think for some people that have very little, that's one of the few things they're kind of clinging to, and then they've been told this their whole lives. And there's been very little in their experience to force them to question that. And now this is being stripped away from them. It must be very disorienting and terrifying.
Richard, that's my son's favorite quote. I have to tell you, that's why I'm laughing.
Yes.
And just let me say, I think Joseph is gone, and he talked about being, when he's the only person that's different culture in a place. and I want to say there is, if you're all human beings, it's not a difference. In another half an hour, I'm going to play a tennis game, and I'm going to be the only black person, I'm sure, in this club. It's okay, because I'm just going to kick their ass. That's it. You know, that's my modus operandi, because I'm good at it, right? Yes. So what I'm saying is, if we see each other as children of God, because I'm Christian, then it's not a problem. It's not an issue.
I guess
there's no other. And the last thing I'm going to say is, when the first human beings left Africa, and I read about this in Guns, Germs, and Steel. I forgot the name of the author. And in Sapiens, the way societies organize themselves is hierarchical. Race became of that hierarchy as societies got more and more sophisticated. And so we come by this, I don't want to say honestly, we come by this evolutionarily.
So you think it was the natural order, or it wasn't? Because I feel it was imposed by people with power to sustain and consolidate their power.
Absolutely. I don't think it was a natural order. I think it was an evolutionary order, destructive as it was.
It was an economic development, because you had indentured servitude, but like it's basically within a certain society. And then as imperialism and colonialism grew out of like England and Western Europe, you know, it became sort of like an economic development to subjugate and enslave, you know, like these people, right? And then you had that triangle trade, which was very, you know, profitable and reinforcing.
And on that note, I'm going to wrap up here, because we're
bye.
3/4 of an hour past. So,
well, guys, I'm coming back next week if you let me.
Oh yeah, please.
Rick, I need to ask you a question before you go, Rick, please.
Okay, Ginny, go ahead.
Okay, what kind of schedule do you have on Tuesday evenings?
I spend Tuesday evenings with my wife. I spend most evenings with my wife.
Okay, well, yeah, that's wonderful. Well, because I'm sorry, not Tuesday. I'm sorry, Wednesday. I'm talking about Wednesday. I do philosophy with Austin Philosophy, APDG, Austin Philosophy Discussion Group, and we've been doing ancient Greek, Roman period, and I would love to hear you come in and hear you as to what you would have to say. What we do is watch a half-hour lecture and then have discussion based on what the lecture was about. So it would be just wonderful to hear you and see what you have to say at one of these Wednesday meetings.
Maybe one of these Wednesday meetings.
Well, yeah, Wednesday Central Time, 7 to 9.
But for now, my focus is these ones. This is
Rick, I'm learning a lot. And thank you very, very much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sharon.
And what I find so amazing about Rick is that he knows the subject, but he also knows how to articulate what he knows so that we easily understand what he just communicates so well.
Well said, because I understand nothing. My introduction to philosophy is zero.
Oh yeah, but well, that's what I find amazing about Rick, is that he is able to articulate what he knows so that us common people can really understand what he's talking about.
Well said, Jenny. I agree with you. I agree. Let's give him a hand. Okay.
Anyway, Rick,
so what are we doing next week? The same thing, Rick?
Yeah, we'll continue with the same essay next week.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Talk to you later.
Thank you. And bye, guys. Dave, I'll see you next week, Dave.
Okay. Also, thank you, David. Thank you so much, David. Okay.
David, thank you very much. And I'm going to come to that contract with God on Friday night. That's another one I love. Right?
I hope to see you there.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye.
All right, next week, everyone.